The following podcast is proudly brought to you by Vite Ramen. Use the link in the description and use offer code BROKENSILICON to get 10% off tasty, healthy, and easy to make ramen. And also use the offer code BROKENSILICON to get 25% off Windows keys and die shrink to get 3% off everything else on the website at cdkeyoffer.com. Now on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I'm joined by someone who's already been on twice. It's always been a fantastic discussion that ebbs and flows from usually a few subjects we've laid out into many more connected to them because he has such a deep knowledge just not only on developing games, but on utilizing the hardware to run games and how that actually works and clearing up misconceptions. And looking around at some Alchemist stuff coming out now, I couldn't think of a better person to have on to discuss it. But of course, first, even though you've been on twice, tell everybody, who are you?
Hey, I'm Bryan Heemskerk. I'm the art director at Massive Damage Games. So, I worked in a lot of different engines. I've shipped a bunch of games. I've worked in the game industry for about 10 years now. So, done mobile, done console and whatnot, done PC development. My jobs are primarily art-based, but I've been unusually obsessed with the tech side. So having a barrage of render techs and programmers and whatnot, I'm always keen to get the most information from all of them. And usually when I go to the game conferences, I try to look for even more information. So anyways, that just kind of puts me in a unique position amongst a lot of artists. So that's me for the most part.
Yeah, and you say atypically you're interested in this stuff, and I usually bring that up at the beginning of the episode as well, that it is rare to find someone who's interested in optimizing this stuff that it isn't their entire job. It's usually someone puts their head down, this is the aisle I'm walking down, whereas you seem to really want to understand why things are going wrong or going right.
Well, I work with a lot of devs, and I've been told that I'm absurd, at least from a tech perspective, because they've worked with a lot of artists. All of them have worked at different studios at different points in time, lots of artists. And artists, half of the artists, you mentioned something like ambient occlusion or whatever, subsurface, well, not most of the subsurface scattering, but they might not, when you start talking about, draw order or your Z buffer, you start getting into specific aspects of rendering, they'll just be like, I'm out. Let me know what to draw and I'll catch you later. But I'm much more interested in kind of asking and following that pipeline and saying, hey, what do you mean by this? Where does this go? What is this? What are the implications of this? What is the trade-offs of this? If we give this, what do we get here? What do we have to compromise to get what we want in a game?
So an opening reader mail I have here before we really get into it. Timo H writes in. He says, hi, Tom and Bryan. Last time Bryan was anxious that they couldn't get any graphics cards in the studio to make their games on the newest hardware. Has the situation improved recently?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's been we used to build all our own computers. So we would build, when we had new staff or whatnot, we'd build custom rigs, but we ended up having to partner with other companies to get complete rigs just to get the good. For a while, you couldn't get a decent GPU at a decent price unless you had it all pre-built. So we kind of were forced into the pre-built scenario for a bunch of them, but it seems to be working out okay. There's a bit more thermal issues, but it's mostly fine.
Yeah, I remember during, I think this had to have been late 2021, I had on one of the heads of the studio that's working on upcoming Dune games. And he talked about how sometimes they'd show off a PC running a build and people were tweeting at him, I can't get any graphics cards. Why are you bragging about this? Whatever you have. And he's like, you have no idea how many months it took us even to get this graphics card just to be able to program the game. We're in the exact same boat as all of you guys.
Yeah, it's been very difficult. It was for a period of time extremely difficult to get graphics cards. And you got to keep in mind too that devs need more hardware than gamers because they're running apps simultaneously. Because oftentimes I'm running Maya or in ZBrush with Unreal or Unity with Photoshop open. So I mean, there's very few gamers that are running all of those apps simultaneously. So there is kind of a need to over hardware in that space. And we're not talking about like miners, like thousands of GPUs that you'd be buying. We're talking about like a studio of 20 to 100 people that would need that GPU to make your next game, right? Or hopefully a game that you might play.
When I'm like editing a video, I will sometimes be checking something, making sure everything was implemented correctly. And then at the same time, I am putting together a thumbnail in another app that actually is putting in 3D models to make the picture for the thumbnail. And, people, when I'm gaming, I rarely actually need more than 8 GB of RAM to this day. But no, the 3070, which I've already covered, I've already upgraded to a 3090 that I got for half the MSRP almost.
Yeah.
It's already made a difference. Like
24 gigs.
Yeah, and like there were things that I just wasn't sure why this app would sometimes crash or get unresponsive, even though in the task manager it would say it wasn't using all of the VRAM. All of a sudden now it's just using over 12 gigabytes at all times when I'm using these apps, and it's like, so like maybe it was at 7 gigabytes, but it was an issue the whole time. I haven't had any app rendering anything crash since I've gotten the 3090. It's clearly just got more than enough, and having more than enough is really important anytime you multitask, even if the software is making it seem like you don't need more, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, obviously a lot of software will just scale to the hardware you have. So a lot of these programs, they'll steal as much buffer of memory as they can, and then they'll steal hard drive space to compensate for whatever they can't grab. So it's kind of dynamic, but your apps will be noticeably slower. I find that oftentimes I'll end up I'll run a game, or I'm running like a program. Let's say I'm doing a bake of light maps or something in Engine. Then that's going to use so much GPU resources, but I'll have some other application over and I'll do work on the lowest common denominator. I might have to draw a texture or something like that, and I'll try to optimize my workflow. So having some overhead in hardware is super useful for that. Interesting enough, when we were building the computers for our work, when we were getting the computers for our work, we went half 5950Xs and half 11900Ks. But we have had some overheating issues with the 11900Ks. Some people's hard drives just stop running at certain points in time just because there's so much heat in the case that at some points in time. So we're seeing some interesting things. I mean,
no, but I've seen that before too, where I check my temperatures in my case, I check everything's going well, and depending on the card I have, some cards do a better or worse job of actually getting the heat out of the case.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of the Founders Ampere cards were actually pretty good at making half the heat go out of it. And before that, I had a card I tested that just blew all of it into the case with these massive fans. And there was like one 120 millimeter fan at the top of my case that was like making an odd noise. So I just unplugged it for a week. Cause like, whatever, I don't think I'm pushing my case super hard anyways. I noticed weird stability things. And when I plugged it back in, they went away. And I'm like, you'd think things would just throttle if they got too hot. The VRMs weren't getting too hot, but this fan just over the VRMs was clearly making some difference to stability that I wasn't expecting. So I can imagine.
I find with pre-builts, the issue is storage, actually, a lot of the time.
Interesting.
When there's too much heat in the case, sometimes NVMEs just disappear from if they get too hot and there's not proper heat dissipation, sometimes they just will disengage, and you'll be like, I lost access to whatever my cache is or whatnot. So there is some difference. It's 90% of the time it's fine, but there are some edge case scenarios that are kind of interesting when you have essentially two identical pre-builts with the only variance being the CPUs, the GPUs but then the people with the Intel CPUs we've seen a little bit more of like hard drives just not rendering, like not, I can't think of the term right now, but it's not visible in Windows until they turn it off and cool it down for a bit. And then all of a sudden it comes back on.
And you're sure it's specifically like a radiator or something blowing hot air from the i9 into the case? Or do you think there's a chance the CPU is just getting hot and some part of that controlling the hard drive just became unresponsive?
Yeah, I think it just might be total heat dissipation, that there's just that little bit pushing even more heat into the case, and then it's being pushed out, but it's just the ambient temperature is probably up by 5 or 10 degrees, but it's just enough to start getting a little bit more weirder stuff between the two. But they both run really great. They're very good pieces of hardware. It's just interesting to kind of see when we got half of the staff one or the other, and we've just been kind of checking. All we've been checking is who's been having more problems. So we haven't been asking, are you so much slower or whatnot. It's just when we get hardware faults where they seem to be lying. So it's been a little interesting. We just did like a little test case in our own studio of like 17 people, which isn't a huge sample size, but it's still kind of interesting when you start getting some of those results.
Well, this starts getting me into a good segue for our main discussion for today, which is, and I don't want to do the whole spiel now because I've got a few things I want to say about Alchemist moving forward, but I don't know if people understand, like, when they see me they say I'm being negative towards Alchemist or something.
Mm,
It's not that I don't think it's actually going to hit the targets I leaked it would, what now, 2 years ago? It's so late. I think it will at the clocks I expect it to need to at the clocks I expect it to need to be at. I think will perform in some games like a 3070 or 3070 Ti. That's not my
mm,
concern. I would prefer it to underperform but be stable than to launch a product that in some cherry pick things you can point to and say, "Oh, see, it's this," but then not be able to have 100% confidence if you were to give this to your niece or nephew, because that's a thing I think about all the time, is like when people ask me what they should do, my recommendation isn't exactly the same as if I was giving it to Dan or myself, who are
yeah.
enthusiasts. It's like, well, if you're willing to do this, actually this is probably a good option. If I'm giving blanket advice to people, I'm just going to be super conservative and try to tell them to get something that I know will work. I
Yeah.
don't know that I can do that with Alchemist, though. That's
Well,
the
yeah.
problem.
I found myself in the exact same situation with anyone that I know that's going to be doing art production. I would love for AMD to get more market share with GPUs specifically, but I find myself typically recommending NVIDIA GPUs to anyone that I know that's going to be doing any artwork with it, not because of, it's not really a hardware deficiency at
Mhm.
all. It's just the ecosystem is so locked down currently
It
that
might not even be a stability thing, right? You just know the apps will use the NVIDIA thing, right?
I've used, like, games aren't actually the problem. It's all of the art software for the most part. So I I've used whatever, like Blender, Maya, like all of the major, all the major engines, all the major, like even Adobe, all the acceleration, all of the things in that are currently more biased towards NVIDIA. They just have way more support for it. So if I know someone's going to be interacting with any
Mhm.
of those, then I'm far less likely to recommend even a better AMD GPU at a price. If the person's just a gamer, I'll typically recommend an AMD GPU. I'd love to recommend whatever's the best in every circumstance and the playing field to be equal, but I don't want the person that I recommend hardware to have a bad experience. And
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
problem I have with it is I want understanding to be, I wish the general understanding of hardware was a little bit higher across the board so that we might be able to start to mitigate some of these issues, because I this is kind of the heart of the issue with the Intel Arc issue is the software optimizations, the software layer, driver APIs, all of these things, how they perform and what's taking up extra time, weird stability issues, whether acceleration's being taken advantage of. All of these little things come together and they make this picture of a GPU. And yeah, I mean, it makes it very hard when you have a new ecosystem. So I guarantee Intel would have loved to have launched Arc in only their own environment with only their own software without having to think of APIs so that we could
Mhm.
get a strictly hardware take on what the hardware is capable of. But instead, we are viewing the Intel launch as muddied by the entire infrastructure. So, and it's to some extent, it's going to make AMD and Nvidia look really good because
Yeah.
the people complain about AMD stuff, like compared to what Intel is seeing right now, AMD looks like the most competent company on the face of the earth when it comes to drivers, and Nvidia just looks like godlike.
Mhm.
And frame times have gotten so much better. Frame times have
Oh
gotten
my
so
god, I
much,
know.
and frame consistency has gotten so much better. So it's really interesting to see a launch like this amidst a period where AMD and Nvidia have really been pushing each other to optimize.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's something I talked about with my usual co-host Stan on the last Broken Silicon, that I remember all the way back, honestly, God, when I was finally moving away from GC, well, standard old school GCN, shall we call it, to more like
Mm.
Polaris and Vega stuff. And I said, I got to say, this Polaris and then especially the Vega GPU I tested just feels a little smoother at the same frame rates than my old Fury. and I like had I forgot, like something broke. I sent it back to be refurbished. I sold something, and so I was like, oh, I need a graphics card to use for like half a week. I put in the 7970, and I was like, these frame times are not as good as the last two generations. And then when I tested RDNA 1, I said I only had a 5700, not a 5700 XT, and I was like, well, the average frame rates, this seems to be like 30% worse than my Radeon 7, but I
Yeah.
gotta say, it only feels 10 to 20% worse. Like, I was like, I noticed immediately, even early RDNA's frame times were just better. And I just recently tested the 6500 XT with a 1650 and a few cards that
Mhm.
included the GTX 580, a 3 gigabyte edition. And I was like, God, you guys have no idea how bad frame times used to be. Like, we are so spoiled by the consistency now. And even on consoles as well. I just want to
Oh
point out the
yeah.
consoles feel so smooth at 60 now
I,
compared to
I think it's funny when you looked at I remember looking at like the Xbox 360 to PS to PC graphics comparisons at the time, and you have a pretty sizable difference. And now when you watch whatever Digital Foundry or the Spanish equivalent that I always watch, Elena de Bits or whatever, they always have. It's you're like seeking the details. It's almost always shadow resolution. It's
Mhm.
little tiny things that you're finding. It's not the visual makeup of the game so much anymore that you even perceive. But I came from a worse camp than that. So I had 4870 X2
Mhm.
Crossfire GPUs,
Yeah.
two of those in Crossfire. And then I
So
had
four dies total then.
4 dies total. And I had, then I went to 7870s in Crossfire. And then I went to two GeForce 680s and then two 290Xs. But I had software and I was playing a game, and if it actually had decent frame pacing, then I'd run both. But I remember there was like a custom bit of AMD and Nvidia software at the time that I would use to manually disable GPUs on or off depending on the game, because the frame times might be so terrible. So
Mhm.
the fact that we used to recommend SLI is crazy because the frame times were so terrible. They were insanely bad. But now frame times have gotten so much better in most games, which is why we almost forget what it used to be like, and then we pull Arc onto the scene, and it's like, oh my goodness, what's going on with these frame times?
Well, yeah, that's the funny thing too, because I was talking to a friend of the channel, Igor from Igor's Labs, who's doing extensive frame time testing, at least for now, the most extensive I've seen. And he was talking about how bad it felt to play at the same frame rate. And then he like looked at it, and it's like, it's, several generations back. I mean, in some games, it's performing like GCN 1.0 frame times. But that's the funny thing is you look back and it's like near Polaris or something. And then you
Yeah.
look at the spikes all over the place and you're like, oh, man, even Polaris, we've come a long way since that.
Yeah. Well, AMD was operating with like a very little budget trying to fight. It wasn't until so it's kind of interesting. So I don't know if I sent you the API overhead test, but that's one of the interesting issues that is kind of related to all of this is basically sometimes things take way too much time in a frame, and it's so hard to work out what specifically it is. There's so many possible things that it can be. We can get in when you do game development, one of the biggest parts of it is diagnostics. So what happens is typically you'll look at your game running on a specific piece of hardware or whatnot, and then you'll pull up your diagnostics and you'll be like, why is this taking up like 10 milliseconds or something like that? You'll
Hmm.
have a big chunk of time, and then you have to optimize that, whether it's draw calls, or you have a bit of transparencies, or something in the foliage pass when it starts rendering trees. You'll see something like that and you'll be like, why is this taking up so much time on this piece of hardware versus this piece of hardware? And then you optimize down from there, which is, I'd be very curious to see with Intel Arc what specifically is happening there. And one of the things that, if you look at the API overhead test I sent you, is AMD was getting screwed for a long time on draw calls. So, and these are tests that I ran. So, but one of the big things is, if you can see with almost all of the Radeon GPUs, so we have an RX 590
Hmm.
there. In DirectX 11, you get 2 million draw calls, but this is with a 5950X, so keep that in mind. But when you go to DirectX 11 multi-threaded, because it had, I'm pretty sure, this is my speculation talking to some people, because of the hardware scheduler, you're already at the GPU, so you don't have an opportunity to try to get more draw calls basically worked into the pipeline. But with NVIDIA, when they stripped out the hardware scheduler, it gave them an advantage in DirectX 11, 9, and so on. You can get a kind of an extra pass to issue more draw calls,
Hmm.
which is where you get better multi-threading. So we're getting like an additional 50% performance on the the 1060. But if you look at the DirectX 12 and the Mantle draw calls, it's the exact inverse. So it's not a hardware limitation. It's a software, it's a driver overhead that's happening with draw calls specifically. And in modern games in DirectX, it's DirectX 11, sorry, DirectX 9, 10, and 11 are getting to be a little unfeasible because the draw call games are getting more complex and people are expecting a lot of objects in them. But that's just going to make more draw calls. And then game developers typically optimize it by combining meshes or batching as much as humanly possible. But there's a limit where if you want like a big open game or you want lots of stuff in your game, you're going to be creating draw calls for all of that stuff to exist in your space. It's just an instruction telling your CPU telling the GPU to draw anything. So, but where this gets to be important is you can actually see in the chart that I sent you that AMD they optimized like crazy to at least not have the hardware getting worse with the 5700 XT, where before it went from DirectX 11 single-threaded ran worse than multi-threaded. So they went down with, you can see it goes down with the Vega 64, it goes down with the 590, it runs worse in multi-threaded than it does in single-threaded, but it doesn't get hurt almost anywhere near as much with the 5700 XT. So they optimized a little bit around it so that they could actually, and that would fight with weird issues. I mean, the numbers aren't particularly high. Obviously, they would prefer, like the 5700 XT is getting more draw calls in DirectX 12 and Vulkan there than a 3090 is, but which is interesting. There's lots of reasons that these things could be happening. That's just one part of the pipeline. Draw calls are just a very small part of the pipeline, but it's a very hard thing to optimize for because you're kind of fighting old hardware with new hardware. When you're doing ARC, you would want to focus on the things that are going to be in the games going forward, but you might not put a bit of hardware in there to mitigate, to deal with these old legacy issues. And that could be one reason that I've never seen them like say outright, don't play old games. And it's a weird thing. Like, don't trust the performance in old games. Avoid DirectX 11, avoid DirectX 9. It's interesting that they'd even do that. But I would assume this is part of this old problem and probably several old problems associated with older APIs coming into play.
Yeah, I mean, I'll skip ahead then here to just directly talking about what's going on with the software versus hardware in Alchemist. Mazria writes in, he says, provided that Alchemist isn't flawed on a hardware level, do you expect that Intel will deliver the greatest fine wine experience gamers have seen in decades? I can only imagine what those cards could do if they delivered frames consistently and actually worked in DirectX 11 games. And the way I want to frame this, I actually have a lot to say about things kind of before you might even ask this question, is just, do you think Alchemist is going to age well? I think we expect it to improve. It's like, well, I would hope it'll improve with more drivers over time. But do you expect it to age in a similar way to Vega? Because that's another question I had a lot of people ask, like, Wasp Moshman NL ask, is this Vega all over again? Like, do you think this is going to age like Vega? Or I think the best example is GCN 1.0, where they added like 40% performance over time. Or do you think this will just maybe get more stable, but it's not going to solve the performance as much as people think it will?
It really depends on what's causing these frame spikes. I mean, to some extent, NVIDIA and AMD have been cheating on a greater degree with DirectX 11, 10, and 9 games. They have been essentially, the reason your driver is so huge is because they're essentially packing in profiles that are literally changing all of the render calls. So it's barely even DirectX 11 or 10 or 9 anymore. It's however much engineers that they have at those companies changing lines of code whenever it's issuing calls to render specific things. And for Intel to go back through like the entire history of games, it would be ludicrous, especially if they can't get the same kind of gains. If there's something in hardware that's slowing down the amount of, I don't know whether it's a draw call stall or whether it's transparencies or whatever it is that's sapping the card, it could be, and this is where I would love for one of the games, like devs of one of the games that have known problems with ARC, just to buy an ARC GPU, throw it in their rig, run their engine, and run some diagnostics on it. Because that would be the most useful thing we could see, is where in the profiling it's coming up with these issues. But unfortunately, most people don't love to go back to their old projects. So it's very unlikely.
Well, and I will say, let me do this. I kind of want to recap Alchemist a little bit, because as we discuss what's probably going wrong here, a video I'm working on looking at Alchemist, like a final report on really what I think people should expect, what they should prepare themselves for, what they should be buying into, and what is probably just trying to save face. I'm like going back through all of my old Alchemist leaks for 2 years that I've been doing and like looking at, and I've been noticing these little hints of things that didn't stand out to me before, but now do. And I think where I want to start actually is just asking you generally, and I think this may have been in 2018. It's hard for me to remember anymore, but like 2018, 2019, Intel started announcing they're going to make discrete graphics cards again. And they announced the, Alchemist, the Arc Odyssey, and said, we're going to compete with enthusiast gaming and mid-range gaming with our set of, discrete cards that we launch, which I think I need to remind everybody. Like this DG1 was the original beta that they should have started working on their drivers,
the
and learned
drivers and
all
stuff
the
like
issues
that.
they're having now. You would have thought they would have had that their first try. This is their second attempt, everybody. But what did you expect back then before DG1 even came out?
It really depended. I was, seeing the talent acquisition, they had the right talent to do it. I mean, at that time, they had Jim Keller. They had like a lot of really interesting people at the company that could have done very interesting things. But then we were coming out of a window of mass stagnation from Intel before any kind of resurgence, where we watched a company that was literally like a 50th of its size actually competing in hardware, which was like a tooth. I don't even know how to describe it. It's just so strange that AMD was even able to compete. But so I guess my personal thoughts were I didn't know what would happen. I knew that they had the resources. I just wasn't sure if they would be able to pull it all together. And I also know that making a GPU is really hard. Like what we're expecting now from games is ludicrous. The amount of frame time that you have before you're trying to get a frame on the screen, and all of the different render calls, all of the, like when you look at everything that goes into a frame, there's so many stages. And then we have optional stages if we want to build a BVH structure for ray tracing or things like that. There's so many things that can compete for frame time. And you have this fixed function hardware, and AMD and Nvidia have been building little accelerators or ways to look at specific sets of those codes, accelerate those codes for forever. And that's not held by one or two of the people that go from AMD to Intel. That's like this weird monolith where all of these engineers are working on an individual
this
component.
hive mind that has been working as a team for decades.
Yeah. And you might get a piece of that when you take some of the hires over, but you're not going to get all of it. And a lot of it too is a lot of the designs they're doing now are being tested by AI and stuff outright, rather than, so it's like you have one individual that's communicating with an AI to hash out one specific set of instruction sets, how they run, what kind of hardware accelerators you need for that, and then it all comes together into a design at the end. And I guess Intel had the resources to pull it off, but trying to go from 0 to 30 series in one generation is kind of, it's a big ask. It's a really big ask. Even on a superior node, it's a big ask. It's aggregated tweaks and shifts in hardware. They're competing with Nvidia, like doubling the shaders in one generation. Mind you, they're much lower IPC than the previous shaders, but still, there's weird little innovations like that, like AMD building their ACE engines and then doing all of that. And then Nvidia and AMD have been doing back and forth innovation that have been pushing the game industry forward together. And then Intel has to catch up, and releasing to Windows in the API ecosystem would be the worst case scenario. I bet Intel would have loved to be the hardware in the Steam Deck or something. Before,
or like a console where they're just programming to the metal. They don't need to worry about any of this stuff. Yeah.
Well, because then they'd at least have something to point to. So even if they released their PC cards and they didn't perform to spec, they could be like, but look at it here, right? That's something they could have done, but they don't really have any of the design wins right now to do that. So it makes the impression of it a little bit harder. And this is something that I have talked to you about it in the past, because a lot of it is perspective. Like Radeon cards have always been better than they performed, right? NVIDIA's been able to get away with giving the least hardware in the Windows space comparatively. And AMD always had to overspec their hardware to compete in Windows due to specific issues with the ecosystem. But Intel is kind of facing the worst of both of those fronts. It doesn't have the years of optimization and experience. It doesn't have the giant array of, and like the diagnostics NVIDIA and AMD have at this point in time, in terms of noticing common bugs across lots of games, writing drivers. Like there's so many times I bet that one of the driver techs gets an issue in a game that comes up, and they just, the way that it's reproducible or the way that it's written or that it's documented to them makes it solved at their end very easy. But then they're like, oh my goodness, this has been plugging 50 other games. And then they can take that in the driver and go back over all of those games and make adjustments to them. So they have the benefit of having that much data aggregating for that long.
But I'd like to push back on that notion, because if you go to the Steam survey, the number one GPU market share is Intel. They have integrated graphics in everything. They've been working on integrated graphics for a decade, and these graphics are not as weak as people act like they are. No. I had a Broadwell APU in a MacBook that I installed Windows on because I couldn't stand Mac OS, and I was able to play Battlefield 4 online on my MacBook with integrated Broadwell graphics. Broadwell really impressed me. And since then, I'm not really sure what's happened. There's been scaling issues, software issues, but I remember this making headlines with Tiger Lake, which is about as strong as an MX350, which is, about as strong as, I don't know, a 750 Ti or something, maybe a little better than that. And that's, not nothing. You're getting to close to PS4 graphics at that point, which is still the standard performance. So you'd think you'd want to optimize that. And I remember a few months ago, they talked about how Halo Infinite still can't boot on Tiger Lake graphics, which is just absurd. I disagree. They have had a decade to optimize their drivers, and they are 10 times bigger than AMD. If they haven't gotten this done by then I would argue there is a fundamental problem with how this company operates, because they have had the biggest GPU market share. Check Steam. They have had a decade to get their shit together. They just haven't.
So I guess my argument, I agree with you, but if I was to play the devil's advocate on some of this, we'd have to understand first and foremost what is architecturally fundamentally different between Alchemist and what they've been releasing prior to now.
Still based on Gen 12 graphics from Tiger Lake, so it's the same overall.
The cores are the same, the FP units are the same.
It'd be like calling the Steam Deck RDNA 2. Yeah.
So I'm curious how much of it's reusable between or whether the tile. I mean, it could be an issue with the tile infrastructure and the way that they're putting those together. Yeah, you're right. They should be doing better. Like, I fully agree that they should be doing better in this regard, that they should have enough data aggregated to be making these decisions. But it's weird because their driver interface, I don't even know how they haven't improved when you install an Intel driver, it looks like you're installing something from 1994. And I don't know how they haven't updated all of their ecosystem to that point. Yeah, I guess you've kind of stumped me on this one because they do have the most people using graphics. We're not saying you need to get 1080p 120 frames, but whatever, even better. You're optimizing for something really weak, get it to a low level, scale up the software. AMD is, it doesn't matter. It does, but it's like, when I have all these old cards that I test and I download. At a certain point, there are these cutoffs where it's like, this is the driver for a 7970. This is the driver for Polaris. But I forgot where the cutoff is, but it's like Polaris through Vega. It's the same goddamn driver. We're talking about cards with 4,000 shaders and 500. Like, this is the same driver. They didn't have a different one. Yeah, and this is the same Intel drivers between the two, or are they new packets?
I don't think so with Alchemist, but you see what I'm saying, though? It's like AMD has cards that are 20 times stronger using the same driver. So there's something to be learned by optimizing to Tiger Lake's graphics and then scaling it up to just what is effectively a discrete Tiger Lake card.
Yeah, I'm very curious. I would love personally to talk to an Intel engineer to see exactly where it's going wrong, what specific, and why it needs rebar. Why they weren't able to optimize down to essentially smaller packets versus having one big chunk of data coming through. It's very curious to me why it, out of all the architectures, would need that specifically and why it's so critical.
This summer, whether you're getting exercise outside or finding ways to stay active indoors like me, it's always nice to have something around that acts as a quick and tasty meal that's also healthy, full of protein, and reasonably priced. For me, that's Vite Ramen, who is a sponsor of this piece of content. Vite Ramen is an American company that pays its workers fair wages and crafts a protein and nutrient-dense meal that takes minutes to make without sacrificing taste. In fact, it's even quicker now with Ramen Go, a product that offers the same calories and taste as their traditional V3 packages you're probably used to now if you're a follower of this channel, while allowing you to even more quickly make your food or bring it to work for lunch. And they keep updating their recipes, like the new V3 edition of beef pho, so you keep having fun new flavors to try. Click the link in the description and use the offer code BROKENSILICON to save 10% off a variety of different special bundles just for Moore's Law fans that include things like spoons, chopsticks, and more if you so choose. This is a great deal for you, and it helps support this channel tremendously. Seriously, I eat it. It's tasty, it's healthy, it's fast. They keep making even better and better recipes that are quicker and quicker to make, and it's reasonably priced. Try Vite Ramen today. Well, let me start recapping here kind of my Intel Odyssey of following what's going on at the company, because I wonder if it'll bring up any ideas. So I remember the first big leak I kind of had, I want to say was in 2019 at some point. This is actually after the first leaks started coming out, pointing to a certain amount of execution units per tile. I remember I did a video, my channel was really new, where I was like, yeah, if they scaled it up linearly, they should be able to beat a 1080 Ti. But then I got a big scoop in 2019 where I had multiple people confirming they had been shown this prototype behind the scenes. You know, these are people who got me Alder Lake information, who got me Redwood Cove information early. These are those types of who told me about Lunar Lake and like all these other things long before other things. So these are people at Intel, and they said they're showing this thing to select engineers behind closed doors that's beating a 2080 Ti in 4K at this one game. I'm not going to say which game, of course, but the problem was it seemed to be using 1,000 watts. And I thought that was hilarious. And they were like, we think it's at least 4 tiles, maybe 8. Then the rumors became 4. Then the rumors became 2. And it became clear that the issue is communicating between the tiles.
Their version of Infinity Fabric, whatever that is.
Yeah, it's just not efficient. And then we get to like, I believe it was like late 2020 where I first leaked that it was going to be on 6 nanometer, 2 tiles at most, and that they wanted to be TSMC's 6 nanometer launch partner, which is just hilarious because I just don't, I think I need to communicate this, guys. They wanted Alchemist to come out early 2022 at the latest, late 2021, and the 6500 XT launched on 6 nanometer before them. They didn't want that to happen. And then in late 2021, I leaked that the specs of what the A770 is now, the rough specs, 512 execution units. So I've had the specs for these cards for 2 years. You know, they had a 192-bit card. Actually, I was going through one of my old leaks where I said I think it would be probably what we call the A750 now. I said this seems to be 384 execution unit, 192-bit. And I'm like, it makes sense if you have to disable the yield by 25% to just disable the bus as well. But then I said in the video, I think it'd be smarter if they just kept the full bus and made it 8 gigabytes and beefed it up a little, which it seems like that's what they're going to do.
Well, they didn't think they had much of a choice.
Yeah. You know, and so you're kind of seeing this thing where they always have had the potential. They've always been able to do it, but it's not quite hitting something. And this really stuck out to me, which I looked into these notes from early 2022, where one of my best sources was shown a model that he said was narrowly beating the 3060. And they said there were 2 models above it. So again, guys, this was the A750, and there were 2 models above it. And now we know they're only going to launch 1 model above it. And he said back then they were only showing old games. They wouldn't show any DX12 games, which is weird to me because everyone's talking about DX12 now. When they first showed off around 3060 performance, again, I won't say the exact game, but the example I give that's kind of analogous is, what if they showed you Assassin's Creed 3 instead of Valhalla or Odyssey? You'd be like, why are you showing me Assassin's Creed 3? We're like 3 Assassin's Creed laters. And all of the games they showed were like before 2014.
Okay, I have a couple of things that I can say about some of that. So maybe they wanted to, I'm just trying to track different things that you said. So
Yeah.
when they wanted to be a 6 nanometer partner, I'm curious whether that has anything to do with their GPUs at all, or whether if they have any more trouble on their own nodes, whether they just need to be able to say to shareholders that they have experience to pivot. Hey, we've
Mm.
already released 6 nanometer products. If we need to take advantage of six nanometers, we have experience with that. Just to say to general shareholders, don't freak out. I'm curious with that
Well, they
specifically.
never said it publicly until it was long after that. But I wonder if
Yeah.
that's something they wanted to be ready to announce if it was going to happen.
Yeah, so I'm curious with that, especially with all of the delays they faced in their own fabrication. The other things that you were saying were, I'm curious because obviously there are engines. So when you say Assassin's Creed, I'm curious if what the game is because, for instance, if it was like Battlefront or if it was Battlefield or was it like an RE Engine game or something like that, there are some really amazing optimizations that those games do, regardless of the API, that
I'll,
make them
I'll
run.
say it. It was a Frostbite game.
That's what my guess was. So I
Okay, I'm
was
glad I admitted it here. I
I
think
was
it's safe
about to
to say
admit,
that.
I was about to
I'm
guess
not
that.
going
I'm
to
like,
say which series it's from because there are a few of them that they make, but it was
yeah,
a
yeah.
Frostbite game.
I was unlikely to believe it if it was an Assassin's Creed game because they don't seem to have the same level of optimizations. But if you're talking like a Frostbite game, or if you're talking even Snowdrop within Ubisoft, or
Hmm.
something like that, then I would be like, okay, they've done really interesting hardware optimizations before. And I would be really curious whether there's like something that they have some acceleration for that specific game is doing that they can take advantage of it. Like Battlefront 2 as a
Hmm.
Frostbite game looked better than almost everything else that came out on
Yeah.
PC that year and ran twice as well. So there's some APIs have some amount of effect for sure, but they're not always like DirectX 11 gets rid of a lot of potential issues developers can create for themselves in comparison to 12 or Vulkan. And sometimes you make more issues for yourself in rendering than you would be able to gain by the fact that DirectX 12 and Vulkan just let you have access to more power. You can waste that power a little bit easier in those APIs versus like, a really good example of this is Arkham Knight on console, not on PC. So they didn't go to Unreal Engine 4. They stayed on 3 and modified it to push the visual effects they wanted to the moon, as opposed to going to 4, having a new base level of effects, but not being able to do the art direction that they specifically wanted. And sometimes you get very interesting things where, because as soon as you go from Unreal 3 to 4, and it might be possible with some of these older engines, then it's so much more post heavy, right? You have all of these post effects. They're going to use a bunch of base performance. You have just sometimes the way that the pipeline structured could be less performant for specific type of workflows. And some really interesting games that we see historically using an older version of an engine to do really interesting things, or like the original BioShock did that.
Mm.
They took the older version of Unreal 3, sorry, Unreal, it was like 2.5 they called it. So they didn't go to 3 just so that they could build all of their own custom water tech into it and use the performance overhead instead of going to the new engine and having the performance overhead wasted on whatever Epic deemed necessary. You can go back
Mm.
and you can push that to the moon. And so the two games I can think of like that are BioShock and specifically The Dark Knight on console. PC is a different story. But
Yes.
why I say that is they might have found some optimization in some Frostbite thing, and maybe they could have been talking to, because the Frostbite engineers are geniuses. There's some really amazing engineers at Frostbite, and they could have been talking to some of them, and they could have done a specific acceleration for a very common graphics feature that whatever Battlefront or Battlefield could have been using a ton of. And then when you ran those games specifically on their hardware with those optimizations, they could have had massive performance in those specific games. When I was talking to you last time about the
Hmm.
Intel Arc GPUs, what I said is what Intel has to watch out for is their lowest common perception, not their. NVIDIA enjoys being the standard. A 2070 is a 2070, or a
Mm.
3070 is a 3070. For AMD and Intel, people don't perceive it as that. They don't perceive a 6700 XT as a 3070 equivalent. They perceive it as randomly between a 3060
Yeah.
and between a 3070 Ti. It fluctuates in that range. And when I said,
and I think, by the way, Nvidia knew this, and one of the reasons they gave the 3060 12 gigabytes is they knew their fans would compare it to the 6700 XT, even if the 6700 XT is like what 30-40% better or something.
well, I guarantee if you had these two cards in a console, they would tell a very different story. It'd be very interesting to see what those two specific cards, when they're each their own baseline, separate from each other and optimized. But the ecosystem, unfortunately, lets NVIDIA be the standard, which is a good thing for NVIDIA. But Intel's facing that even worse than AMD. So AMD deals with the difference between being perceived as a 3050 to a 3070 Ti, 3060 to a 3070 Ti with the 6700 XT. And Intel could be dealing with like 2060 to 3060, or like even worse, a 2050 in some cases. And people will have a hard time because if they happen to want to play a specific game, let's say something that always runs terribly, like PUBG or whatnot, on most hardware, whatever the game is, there'll be a game that doesn't run particularly well on certain hardware, but it just happens to be the game you play, and you see someone that spent the same amount of money on a GPU and their game runs so much better. Then those are the things that Intel always had to watch out for. And it ended up being, that was the thing that I thought was oddly prescient. I watched yours in my last talk again when we were talking about that. And I was like, yeah, I was really worried. I wasn't worried about Intel's peak performance and what it matched. I was really worried about how wide their threshold of variance was going to be between being compared to an NVIDIA card.
Well, yeah. And, I expected there to be all different types of outcomes. I knew what their goal was. And I think if people go back and watch my videos, I've always been pretty clear. Intel wants to hit the 3070 or 3070 Ti. I can't promise you they'll succeed. That was their goal. And I always thought it wouldn't surprise me if they had a card that once in a blue moon, it's that good, but on average, it slightly loses to the 3070, but it works. What we're getting is something that is underclocked, a little below a 3070 on average, but it's just not stable. And I think that's so much worse than falling short. Like, what you fell short, lose gracefully, and it's fine. Just price it correctly. My problem is it doesn't seem like they're quite willing to lose gracefully. They keep trying to have their cake and eat it too, especially when it comes to their talk about DX12 stuff. So I'm going to ask this question here. Lee Schaub writes in and he says, without a doubt, the Alchemist launch is not without its Achilles heel, whatever it may be. In a video with Linus of Linus Tech Tips about the A770, he explained that the performance or lack thereof is mostly due to DirectX 12 support, and any title using a previous version of DirectX is likely to not fully utilize the Alchemist card. While I appreciate the background information, I like to see the effort Intel is making to set expectations. I'm wondering if this is merely an attempt to save face at an underwhelming product, or maybe if Intel is actually right and making graphics card and goods drivers is just really hard without experience. Well, they've had over a decade, guys, and the number one market share, so they've had experience, in my opinion. But what do both of you think? Is Intel lazy or making GPUs hard? Well, I think we can just answer is making GPUs is hard, and I don't think they're necessarily lazy. But he brings up DirectX 12. This is my problem, though. The titles they showed off early this year were DirectX 11 or earlier. Yeah. Now they're saying don't run games on that. That's not what they were saying before.
They could have had even worse outcomes than they thought they were. They could have been testing a small sample of games where they actually managed to get things mostly under control, very common games. And then when they went a bit wider, they realized there was even more problems than they initially realized. The other thing, I mentioned this, I think in my first talk, but I randomly got seated next to one of the lead artists on Red Dead Redemption 2 on a plane. And when I whispered to him, it must suck to have your games badmouthed for unoptimized when you have a API overhead issue with draw calls. And he's like, how did you know? So, and that's the reason Red Dead 2 released on PC, my estimation, the reason why it released with no support for DirectX 11, because they didn't even want to deal with that in an open world game. So to some extent, there is a movement in the hardware industry, and AMD for forever wanted DirectX 11 and 10 and 9 to die. It wanted that. And because it was in the same boat Intel's in, because it couldn't go back and get more draw calls in there the same way that NVIDIA could. And what people don't understand most of the time is that creates a stall in the pipeline. So if one thing's taking particularly longer, you have less time. Imagine this is a frame, right? And your draw call section is like this. or like this, or like this. That leaves less time to do everything else. You're literally cutting into the frame time that exists to do other things. So when you have an API overhead advantage for one GPU vendor versus another, that's not a hardware issue. Because the question is, if we ask the Intel engineers if it's better than a 3060 or 3070, it may be. And if we had the engineers talk, I'm sure they'd be really respectful to each other and be like, oh, you did that? That's amazing. You did that? That's amazing. There'd be really insightful things in that. But when the ecosystem doesn't actually allow you to view these things, and most people aren't aware of how those variances in time make such a big difference in overall performance, that if something just takes up more time, you have less time to map your textures, less time to draw all of your whatever, do your shader effects, all less time to throw your particles on screen. You're dealing with this shrunken window of time, and this is where these issues compound. I don't think Nvidia, like, to some extent, it's the prevalence of DirectX 11 games is really hard for any new hardware vendor coming in. It's going to make things almost impossible. It is, to some extent, you could say, well, in Intel's case, if it was another company, you'd forgive them a little bit more. If, like, whatever, Qualcomm decided to release like a discrete GPU or whatnot, I don't even know, just some company decided to release, or Pika, let's say the 3DS GPU developer decided to throw their hands back in the ring and do a big GPU. Let's say that someone like that did that, you'd forgive them for the lack of DirectX 10, 9, 11 support. But you wouldn't forgive Intel because they're so big and they should be able to compensate for it in some way. Just throw more engineers on it. Mind you, a thing to keep in mind, and game studios know this as they scale, is there's only some efficiency in scaling you gain. So to some extent, these giant companies face a problem because they get less utility with each new employee they hire. It's like you lose. So you might be like, throw more and more and more engineers on the problem. But Nvidia has this down to like a crazy pipeline in terms of their communication with game devs. They have like an infrastructure. So when they do new hires, they throw someone in there and they know exactly what they're doing. There's no time lost in communication. They already have the link set out to the game developers to make the adjustments on that front. They have the history of all of that. But when Intel is doing it, they're not coming into it with the same ecosystem in place. So even if they triple or quadruple hire up, even if they hired 3 times as many people as Nvidia had on it, I would imagine that their utility is like 20 to 30% of what an Nvidia hire would be at the same thing, just because the way that they set up their infrastructure is so established, and their pipelines, their links to all of the community are so established, where there's probably innately a lot more floundering with any of the other companies when they're trying to compete.
Yeah, when I joined General Motors, I was thrown into one of the validation groups, and I had 2 senior engineers who were veterans of the company for, I think, at least 20 years each, and their boss, who was a veteran. And they knew immediately everything I could do or couldn't do. There were 2 of them. If I had a question, if one of them wasn't there was another one, and their boss. And they knew exactly where to go. And not just where to go, but who to talk to. Like, literally the name of the person who handles that one thing you need to know about to do your job today. Go talk to this engineer. They're handling this thing on this seat or whatever, Like, and that type of hierarchical historical knowledge isn't. Here's the thing, though. Isn't it there at Intel? They've had a decade of making graphics, though.
No, they don't have the specific aspect that I was referring to was the reach to developers. They don't have the same infrastructure in terms of like contacts. Like, I go to GDC, and before I know it, I'm having drinks with 3 Nvidia outreach people, right? I never had the same experience with Intel. They don't have the same cachet with game developers. They don't have the same experience with game developers. And it's hard if you hire a new hire, right? Let's say you hire someone, but you have contacts at whatever. Let's say you have contacts at Bethesda, you have contacts at this, and you'd be like, hey, you're the new guy, but here's my contacts. Talk to them and see where you can help them. Or if you're at Intel, you might come in and that person would be like, oh, well, here, maybe try to get some communication with Bethesda. It's way different from the outside trying to reach in to Bethesda without having that point of contact and having the established relationship and having maybe an already preset code base that you've already integrated or communicated on, and having the one of the biggest things that people don't understand, I think for the most part, is when you talk to devs, how important documentation is. Documentation is the thing they come back to more than almost anything else. If they are having to implement a new feature, if they have to deal with whatever, DLSS or FSR or whatever, let's just say even NVIDIA Hairworks versus TressFX, and one of them could be a better integrated thing. But if one of the devs comes across it and they look and there's just so much more documentation for one versus the other, they're going to go with the one with more documentation 8 times out of 10 because it's much more clear cut and they have something to refer to if they're going to have trouble with it. And it's really hard. I don't think Intel has the same level of that kind of infrastructure established. I see that all the time.
But this gets us back to the fine wine hypothesis of what might happen. And Taiwan number 1 writes in and he says, "Hi, Tom and Bryan. What would be the incentive for devs to optimize their games and apps for Intel's graphics cards, given that they will likely gain very little market share this generation?" And that's the thing is and this was told to me months ago too, look, Alchemist is about getting widespread support, making sure it's perfect before we launch Battlemage. But from what we're discussing, it's yeah, but is that going to happen? Are devs even going to bother when the performance is like this and they don't? And again, it kind of gets me back to this thing I sometimes say, I don't care what the issue is. Yeah. Is it going to be fixed? Because if it's, they don't have enough outreach, are they going to fix that? Are devs going to pay any attention to them? Do we have any evidence this is actually even going to get better? Do you think how much of that fine wine for GCN was because it was in the consoles and AMD was reaching out to developers?
Well, some of it, they couldn't even take advantage of all of the fine wine from the consoles. And I think I talked about this last time, but there's specific fine wine that's blocked out because of all of the infrastructure issues that you face on PC. So you get a certain amount of fine wine. In the main fine wine, 80% of the fine wine that I saw with Radeon, some of it was RAM. They just gave more RAM in every given SKU, but it's not the biggest component of it. The biggest component was AMD was losing about 40 to 50% of all of its hardware's performance to API overhead, and Nvidia was able to claw it down to about 10% with drivers. And then what ends up happening, the reason you have fine wine is, I'm not saying this is the case, but let's just use them as an example because everyone knows these two GPUs. Let's say in theoretical performance, if RX 490 or 590 is like this and a 1060 is like this, right? But if you're losing 50% of your performance in a game and NVIDIA is only losing 10%, it looks like this, even if the hardware is inverted. So, and this is a situation that we face that is faced all the time. They couldn't optimize around that to an insane degree. But what happens with NVIDIA is as their cards get legacy and the new games don't actually bother to optimize for the legacy GPUs, they start losing the same 30 to 40% of their GPUs. And then part of the fine wine is that the GPUs, as NVIDIA is starting to lose that percentage without clawing it back on a per driver basis for all those games, then the AMD cards look better in comparison. Some of it is that AMD was forward thinking with specific GPU features, specifically half floats, asynchronous compute, things like that, that technically meant that if you used all of the features in of RX 590 compared to a 1060, if you were using just the DirectX 11 features, maybe they were more equal. But if you're actually using async and then on Vega using half floats, let's say, the potential goes up quite a bit. And then they're no longer even cards. And the difference is, and then obviously NVIDIA is enjoying the advantage in the exact opposite with ray tracing right now. They have a ray tracing hardware advantage. So when games start to use more and more ray tracing, and as it becomes a standard, they're going to enjoy the advantage in the fine wine in that regard. The 30 series will age probably better than the 6000 series, not because they're not both amazing. They are. There's really amazing engineering in both of them, but because they're ray tracing techs ahead. And when that becomes a staple in game development, they're going to invert the other way. Now, the question is whether but then the opposite also happens. We talked about this last time where you called me out on AMD's True Audio. So technically moving the audio off, and that was a feature that wasn't utilized. Whereas asynchronous compute was so loved by game developers that it became a standard, right? Half floats is something that they were actually used to in older generations, like the 500 NVIDIA series and prior that they got rid of, and they just standardized the floats across the board, and they realized they can do mixtures of workloads, both for AI and lots of things. There was reasons to have both from a server perspective and a desktop gaming perspective to flag specific workloads for a certain amount of computational intensity, and then that can gain performance advantages. That was very forward thinking. So AMD implemented it first, and it gained fine wine by having features that did become standard. When there's features that aren't standard, those never become fine wine. So the question really is Intel using things that are looking forward? Are there specific accelerator blocks on the CPU, on the GPUs, that are being taken advantage of to do specific instruction sets really quickly that we haven't seen their full extent of use? I don't know. I'd have to talk to an Intel engineer. I'd have to see, because I'd be very interested if you're like, oh, actually, this specific type of workload that we know is like 70 to 80% of game workloads, we put a specific whatever instruction set that handles that perfectly and accelerates that, and there's a set of memory right there for it, so it always whatever they've done, it doesn't make a difference what they've done, but if they've done something like that, that's where the fine wine comes from. Part of it is, if you're eliminating things like RAM bottlenecks so it'll eventually reach its potential. Part of it is API overhead, where when everything is losing the same amount of API overhead, then you actually kind of get to see where the cards actually play out. And in consoles, it's the same thing. If you put those two GPUs in a console, you get to experience the same thing. And part of it is the other thing, that some features are actually going to become standards. And when those features become standards, then that's going to become the fine wine.
But let me know if you think that I'm wrong with this hypothesis on what could be going on with Alchemist here, which is they showed off this stuff. It was mostly older games that were optimized probably to take advantage of CPUs, like a Frostbite game, without needing DirectX 12. Yeah. And they, this was right when they were starting to manufacture the cards. I have the manufacturing schedules. They were manufactured from January through March. They're done. They've made all the cards they're going to make in this existing run months ago. So I assume they're just sitting in a warehouse somewhere waiting to be packaged and sold. Okay, but then why did they not start showing off little things sooner? Because it was so weird. There were these months between March and June where you're just going, well, I know they've made them. They're not showing anything. What and right now, I would argue they're not saying anything right now, right? Like Brett Summers says right now, Intel is saying everything and yet nothing at the same time. They're showing the 750. They haven't even let Linus say what the specs are yet or show real frame time graphs.
Yeah. Same with Gamers Nexus.
But my argument is I'm worried what's happened is they thought it would just take time to make the drivers. The drivers took half a year to a year longer than they expected.
And they're still not where they wanted.
They manufactured the cards, and then they realized a month ago they're never going to fix it. So we just need to launch, and that's why we need to stop. That's why we're not launching the A780, which I've double checked just for people know with people. That was definitely a planned card that they just canceled, and so if they have this driver overhead that they thought they'd fix, they realize they can't fix it. They've already made the cards. Let's just launch mid-range and lower because anything higher is going to have tons of CPU overhead anyways. And then you look at the DirectX 11 they showed off. They thought DirectX 12 would fix it. It didn't, but now they're saying you still need it, even though the first games they showed off behind doors were not newer games.
Well, the hardest sell is the resizable bar thing, because you're basically rolling out all older CPUs. So if it performs terribly, but it requires, it's not performing terribly, it's performing strangely, but it requires modern high-end CPUs I think the only thing that we're missing in that entire window of conversation is that they thought they're going to be launching to a different ecosystem. They didn't know that Bitcoin and Ethereum were going to collapse. They didn't know, value-wise, what they were expecting to have the drivers good enough and come in as a price savior, even if the performance is exactly as it lies right now. They thought if they were half the price, because everything was so inflated and they had a stockpile of GPUs, this is me speaking I know what the heck they're doing. I don't know. This is me speculating wildly. And this whole conversation is very speculative. So some people probably know a lot more than me on this front. But regardless, they thought they were probably going to hit a window and they were going to get a lot of grace for just being in that. And that window disappeared without them really predicting it. And they thought, and it's a weird thing because sometimes you might think, oh, it's 3 months isn't a big deal, but it can be a
Oh
big
my
deal.
God, it's such a big deal. And, I want to be clear that, again, like, even like with it, you've seen some people come out and admit they're Intel engineers kind of in some communities. And they're like, we truly did think we'd have a 3070 competitor in Q1. And the
Well, the
difference
engineers
those 4
probably
months would
did.
make. Yeah.
This is
That's something I've tried to explain too about Intel's foundry issues with 10 nanometer. You guys got to understand that the people designing Alder Lake, the people designing Ice Lake, they thought 10 nanometer would be ready in 2019, 2018. It's the foundry people that were lying to the hardware people that made all of this happen. And so you could see like the hardware people at Intel with the software people. But again, I'm not entirely convinced it's just a software issue. If you have this 11, then 12, then out of nowhere, oh, we're launching and we canceled the top model, but we don't want to admit there was a top model. There's a part of me wondering if they've realized too late there's a fatal hardware flaw and this is never going to be able to perform at a certain level.
This was the talk around RDNA 1, where they kept delaying RDNA 1. That if we go all the way back, the window of time between Vega and RDNA, which is interesting because as soon as they sorted out RDNA, their cadence has been right back on track. But prior to that, when there was doubts, and there's so many things where when you hear the engineers or you hear like the byproduct, the after talk about this, there's lots of times where there's things where it's just taped out. And that's for the next GPU, or the next CPU. You hear that with the Ryzen. They're like, as soon as we finished Ryzen 1, we're like, and even Jim Keller's said this himself in a couple of interviews, where they create a pathway. So they know what the limitations of this product is, but in their roadmap, they know that once they get a little bit more transistor space or whatever, a memory advancement, they can also do these ones. And then they have their own roadmap that intends on specific plans. And when we're talking, and this is a huge... And I see this compartmentalization in game development because it's weird because gamers talk about game developers as a monolith, but game developers are a sea of teams, right? Art is often very separate from design, which is separate from dev, which is separate from like PR and HR and all of the other aspects of the game company, and even the people who do the wheeling and dealing and selling, all of that. And they're isolated, you meet, you talk between them. But when you're talking thousands of employees, there's no way you can have a complete understanding between those different groups. And engineering could have totally nailed this. They could have solved lots of things. They can have a better product than we're seeing right now or we're capable of perceiving. And that software was never able to take advantage of it in the way that engineering tackled some things, and maybe they have some really brilliant innovations that will make them fine wine, like specific types of acceleration that when we see like, I'm curious, has anyone tried running UE5 with Arc yet?
That's the weird thing. It's like, and I was talking to Igor, again, at Igor's Labs about like, I have a lot of fans of mine complaining about like the lack of encoding, professional CAD benchmarks out there. And he's like, it's because half of the stuff crashes. Like we would test it if it wouldn't crash. Like that's why you're seeing only game benchmarks, guys.
Yeah, that's really strange to be getting that much crashing, but it is something that we see with hardware across the board. It's that engineering could have done this, or they could have done something really interesting that requires game developers to do a bit of optimization. The thing is what I was saying earlier when I'm talking if Nvidia sent me an email, right, with a contact that said, hey, whatever, I would be like, oh, okay, cool, I'll talk to you. If AMD did, I would say, cool. If Intel did, I probably would myself, but I think 80% of art directors would be less likely to. Or whatever, game developers in general, like different people at different studios. They understand, and the current market base is obviously going to be a huge, like I sat in it was an Alienware talk with game devs where Alienware was asking all the game devs tech questions. And this was at around Ryzen 3rd gen. And they were just then, like Alienware being like, what is your guys' perception of Ryzen? Right? So this is like 3 generations in so the marketing that they were so delayed in terms of integration. If you can imagine something being essentially 3 years behind on a hardware that was starting to actually gain a lot of momentum at that point in time, you can kind of imagine that with Intel's first generation of GPU, what the ramp up would be and what the
second.
Yes, a second.
I'm sorry. I like people give Intel, a company 10 times bigger than AMD, too many breaks on this. Like,
okay, second. But
Go on, though.
they didn't intentionally, like they kind of quarantined DG1 themselves. They started to ramp up and then they didn't. And I think that there's also been a huge marketing shift. I think the big threat that we're missing in this conversation so far is Apple has modernized marketing in a specific way. Whether you like or dislike Apple, they have basically cemented the don't say anything you're not going to do in 6 months in the game industry, in the tech industry.
Yeah.
And it's fine to put it on a roadmap, but a roadmap isn't concrete. They intentionally have blocks of time for variants, right? There's windows where you can do that, but when you go and have a conference and show something like this in front of the screen, you need to have it in people's hands within 6 months now. That's the standard. And if Intel knew that they were missing that opportunity, and you talked about when they showed, some artists did some renders,
several artists,
did renders of GPUs, and they saw that the gamer public was being hyped up about it. So then they hired one of them, I think, to design them, and then they showed that off way too early. They showed that design off way too early, and then they've been eating that. It's like some things can exist and do that. Like Nintendo has earned the right to show Zelda 4 years early, but they don't do that with Pikmin. They don't do that with some of their own franchises. There's some games that people were willing to wait for. People want to know that there's a new GTA out there. They want to know that there's a new Red Dead.
Yeah, and I always find that so funny. Like, again, I guess one of the biggest leaks that got me notoriety is when I said like a month before it was announced, the new God of War is going to be announced at their upcoming event. And everyone's like, that's too early. And then it happened. And they're like, I can't believe Moore's Law said got that right. And I'm like, would you not think they're making another God of War? Like, what are you talking about? You know?
Exactly. They're not going to make one of these. They're one of the biggest franchises.
That's the safest thing I said. Like, what are you talking about? Like, I didn't think it'd get any traction. And that was the one no one could believe, you know?
That's so weird. But this is the thing is more people are keeping products closer to their chest for longer. And this is a recent trend that I've seen shift even in the last 10 years. It went and just too many, whatever, The Last Guardians or Kingdom Hearts 3s or whatever else.
Final Fantasy Versus. So I want to come back, though, to this. Like, we can talk about mistakes that have been made before, like poor Volta advertising for Vega. But that was like one thing from AMD, also under Raj Kadori, by the way, that overhyped Vega.
Yeah.
But I got to say, when Vega was about to come out, they were pretty clear about it, though. They were like, here it is. It's compared to a 1080. We're not going to pretend it's anything but that. And that was that. With Alchemist, my problem right now with the marketing is I think a lot of people are looking around and they're like, oh, well, they're being more modest and they're being straight shooters. And from what I've seen in documentation that I've received in the past week, because I don't think people get this, like, Ryan Shrout lying that there wasn't an A780 has stirred up the hornet's nest. If Ryan hears this, I just want you to know your own employees don't like that you are lying, and they've sent me a ton of documentation. So I have proof. You lied. I just want everyone to know that. He's lying, and I now know more about their release schedule. They haven't told you the specs of the A750 publicly, guys. AIBs don't know shit. Like, I'm telling you guys, this isn't coming out next week. And so I don't think people and I'm probably going to delay the video a week because I'm just too high. I gotta like blow off steam with a easier video before I like put some effort into this. But like, this isn't them being modest. They're still, they're overhyping it, even though it seems like they're putting down hype. And now they're telling everyone a bunch of specifics that they're going to have to answer for in a month when they still don't have a graphics card out.
Yeah. I think that everyone could always, it's easier to forgive a company that is at least being a little humble or a little willing.
And they almost were. They almost were.
And it's harder to forgive Intel on the same front because, and this, I think this is the problem when you have pride in one front. Like Intel, obviously, they feel like they own PC hardware and they have a specific perspective around that. And I guarantee that Bryan Heemskerk's a really interesting example. That name itself carries a lot of weight with it. But when it comes to
again, anyone siding with Ryan Shrout, ask anyone who's worked with him what they think of him. But let's
he keeps getting work somehow. But it's interesting when you're talking about the perception and whatnot. I mean, the people. I mean, the other guy, I've seen him, the Nvidia guy that works at Intel now, that's been in all of he's been going around. He's at least a little bit more humble. You
The
can tell
Tom
that
guy?
Tom, yeah, like he just
Oh,
wants to
yeah.
talk
I've
about.
nothing bad to say about him.
Yeah, Tom seems to always have really interesting takes. He's excited about what's in a tile, what the execution units look like. Well, he's happy to talk about those aspects of things. It's kind of weird when you have someone that doesn't seem as well suited for marketing coming out and doing the marketing, but you need, like, in general, both of them, I feel like you kind of get that sensibility where it doesn't feel like the people I want to talk to in that regard. From maybe I want to talk to Tom, but I probably wouldn't want to talk to Ryan Schroed. But it's it's just seeing how they're representing it, and then as soon as they're dealing with the trouble, the way that they're standoffish, that's the hard part. If they were like, hey, we know it's not perfect, but we think that there is use cases for it. It's interesting, and here's some really interesting aspects about it. If they were to play that angle, and I think AMD,
and that's what Tom mostly says in videos, and that's the way to play this. That's a good PR move. Hey, we're going to price it respectively. This is what it does. That's it.
Yeah.
But the problem is you have the other side going, oh, but this is enthusiast gaming, and this is exactly what we wanted it to be 2 years ago. Yeah, we made a die on 6 nanometer bigger than a 3070 Ti, and we intended it to have frame pacing issues and lose to a 3070.
Doesn't it have lots of voltage issues too? I think I was seeing in one of the videos that the voltage is kind of all over the place. The voltage
is. They have an 8-pin on this 75 watt A380.
That's so strange, though, and that could be one of the reasons that we're not seeing the big cards, because of the voltage spikes. It's one thing to have consistent voltage at a specific level, but if you have spikes that are scaling exponentially with the size of the hardware, that could be causing big issues with why they're not actually releasing the larger size tile combinations. Voltage is a different thing.
My opinion on that is I believe the A780 was probably going to target somewhere between 235 to 270 watts. It was going to aim to beat the 3070. So if you think about the 3070, which I believe is a 220 watt card, that's like, okay, a little more energy, slightly better performance, unique features, that would have looked good. Yeah. But if what they do is launch what ends up being a 250 watt card, a 270 watt card, and I'm already seeing some websites covering, it overclocks from like 2.3 gigahertz to 2.6. And it's like, yeah, it's almost like they intended it to be clocked faster.
Yeah.
Like,
did they check the voltage afterwards?
Yeah, maybe they know. Well, yeah, you just tell overclockers you need a 1,000 watt power supply and you can push it above a 3070. But if they were to have launched like not a 235, but like a 250 watt model that still randomly beats a 3070 Ti, but if we're being honest, on average, like in Hardware Unbox 50 game roundup, it loses to a 3060 Ti while using 6,800 levels of energy.
Yeah.
That's a bad look. And so that's why I think they're not launching it, because they know they're not going to win performance on average. So they might as well not have efficiency look horrible.
People are always sensitive to things that underperform. If people, and I think we've seen AMD get more honest with its slides in the last 5 years. I remember...
Yeah, painfully, I would say.
Vega and prior AMD slides were always overshooting. And then after Vega, it feels like their slides were actually almost a little underrepresenting intentionally. Like they're like, if we're always maybe on average 2 or 3% below what we're saying, then we always have face. Then gamers have a pleasant surprise when they put it in their PC versus the opposite. They're upset because they're not getting what they were promised. As someone who tinkered with a Vega, Vega was a strange one for me because it was the most fun card I ever played with. When I got my 3090 and I put it out there, it was the most boring card in the best way, in that I just put it in and I was like, oh, this runs everything great. I'm not even thinking about this. When I had my Vega, I was doing lots of fun stuff on my computer. I bought it was a custom water block from, bought a custom water block, was playing around with that, doing that. And it's kind of, sometimes it's fun to play with a complicated card. For me, it's not something I'd recommend to other people sometimes, but for me, it was a lot of fun to mess around with and modifying it and trying different things. But when it comes to, but AMD has been getting better graces with people as they're improving their driver stack, and even they handled the blackouts somewhat respectably. It seemed like when people were upset with the 5700, then they were getting the blackouts randomly.
Which I was, anyone who thinks I'm hard on Intel, I did an emergency podcast talking about how bad it was and said I cannot for this month recommend any AMD card. I can't. So when it happens, I hit AMD, but they fixed it, and then after that I stopped saying it. And that really was a problem for me because honestly, before that, I usually had more reliable drivers from AMD, but there was just no argument when that happened.
And I don't remember, maybe I was wrong, but I don't remember them coming out and blaming game devs or coming out and blaming operating systems or coming out and blaming gamers, because it feels like as soon as the developer of hardware does one of those things, which is what it kind of feels like Intel's doing a little bit. So when they say it only works with this and you need resizable bar and this and that, it's kind of like putting a lot of pressure on the consumer in a way that...
And I don't think they support resizable bar smart access memory on the AMD cards yet. Their drivers only support... Yeah, so it's that's a huge issue. I don't know if they know, a lot of people have AMD systems.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of Ryzen systems out there, and which has been great for whenever I need a friend. And when I have a friend that has a Ryzen system, as soon as they tell me that, I'm like, oh, you want an upgrade path? You need some more performance? You can just drop something in. That's been pretty amazing. But it's a very interesting thing. I think Intel needed to play the humble angle, as humble as humanly possible, on their first GPU launch. And first of all, they delayed it forever. And then they made it, which pushed it into the realm of speculation, where all of it was speculative conversation of people. We were whispering about it for too long. And then when we whisper suspicions of why we're having performance issues, we're whispering, why is it delayed so long? And they can only delay it so long before they risk a lawsuit with stockholders as well.
What do you mean it launched in Q1? I'm sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that's a risk. There's specific things that different people at the company are weighing the risks of, and they needed to have the most humble launch they possibly could, and it doesn't feel like they've perfectly succeeded at this, and they haven't perfectly succeeded at dealing with the PR around it. I'm very curious as to whether it's a fine wine card. I think if they had more of their engineers talking about some really interesting features about it that could be forward-looking, it would at least give them more... the part of the gaming public that's very excited about those, they could at least talk about that, which could give some hype to future generations as they fix specific things. But it doesn't feel like that's what they're coming forward with. They're kind of giving us a black box and a little bit of talk on the surface level about what's going on there, and then putting the hardware in the hands. But it seems like any of the main review channels that has good relations with Intel on CPU reviewing fronts are a little bit more willing to walk with them on which games they show and things like that right now. And it's only starting to get into the hands of people that are a little bit more willing to just throw everything at it and see what happens. So and I think that gating, unless you're Nvidia, you can't get away with it. I don't think you can get I don't do GPU reviews, but I don't know if AMD gives you as exhaustive a list of things you can't play when you get their GPUs.
They're becoming slightly more Nvidia-like, I've heard, but no, not really. I mean, and I'm just gonna be honest. If you're a channel like Linus, it is up to Linus if he listens to anything you say, because he'll break NDA and he'll just invite you to sue him, and you won't, because that would be a PR disaster.
Well, yeah, Linus's community is his strongest suit. He's got so many people, and I think that the tech channels with the biggest communities are kind of the strongest to stand up to it. Hardware Unboxed is a good example. Level 1 Tech's a good example, where they have really strong communities, so they have the ability to have. It's the small channels that are a little bit harder. If they want to review hardware, they kind of have to follow whatever rules they give them. But I don't know.
Well, let me bring this up too, kind of adding a final thing for why I'm worried it's a hardware issue. Igor found that in 720p, the A380 just starts losing to everything. If you completely remove CPU bottlenecks, the RX 6400, even in games where it was losing sometimes by 20%, just starts winning. Now, you could argue, well, the A380 has more bandwidth. It has, maybe it's just better at running higher resolutions, kind of like Ampere versus RDNA 2. And I would say maybe, but actually, if you look at how fast the memory is in the 6400, it's actually not that far behind the memory overall bandwidth of the A380, and then it has infinity cache. So I don't know that I'm actually convinced by that much.
I think it could be a hardware thing. And the example I'll use is Ryzen 2 to Ryzen 3. So the Infinity Fabric interconnect created, because sometimes we think of we think it should scale infinitely lower. Like go to whatever 360p, go to 180p,
Sure.
and it should scale infinitely. But some of these,
Which I've always had problems with that too, to be fair. But we are talking about weak cards, so it's not like I'm running 720p on a 3090 here. I'm running.
Yeah. But when you look at CSGO, right, there was a hard bottleneck on CSGO with early gen Ryzen 1 and 2. And I don't know whether this is just wild speculation from me, but I think there's a threshold with Infinity Fabric where if it misses the intercommunication, it has to wait for the next run or something like that. So sometimes there's fundamental hardware bottlenecks that are fine 90% of the time, but they stop it from accelerating to the moon. Where as soon as you start scaling the hardware back, right, or like scaling the resolution down to see like what kind of crazy frame rate you can get, you might be introducing a bottleneck of something that operates fine if you operate within its parameters. But as soon as you start operating past its parameters, then it no longer can keep up. So then it slows down everything across the board.
So I just sent you a link over the chat we're using right now.
Yeah.
Here's where I'm going to get into heavy analysis in an upcoming video of Alchemist, and why I think I'm just going to delay it so I can really start looking at each claim Intel's making. Because in their Intel, this bizarre video where Ryan Shrout goes, in these specific games, it beats a 3060, but it might not perform like this in other games. I'm like, what an insane statement. You're basically saying you have no idea how it's going to perform.
Yeah.
One of those games was Control.
Okay.
In Control, in 1080p, the 6400 gets 73 frames a second. The A380 overclocked gets 70. This is supposed to be an optimized game. Now look at it in 720p where the 6400 stays ahead. And then the minimum frame times of the A380 falls off a cliff. Actually, if you look at the frame times, it's almost in 1080p.
Well, it stabilizes between the overclock and the non-overclocked model, which shows us that it's some bottleneck somewhere. So the fact that
you're right. Like just so everyone knows, and again, links will be in the description. Like the A380 and the A380 overclocked get literally the same minimum frames in 720p, and they're way behind a 6400. That tells you if it's a CPU overhead problem, it should be different, right? This seems like a fundamental hardware flaw to me.
It is. That is like when things flatline. That's the flatlining is the most like obvious bottlenecks you could possibly do because it's essentially unable to produce more frame at that specific point in time, and it's flat across the board. Whether you increase clock or whether you scale the hardware, if those lines flatten out, it's very indicative that there's something, whether it's exhausting memory bandwidth and it has to wait till it frees up before it can do something, or whether it's a CPU bottleneck that it just something isn't getting through, and or it could be the interconnect between the two dies. It needs to communicate something over to the other side. And
well, it's just one die right now, though.
Oh, it's one die. So there's one tile.
Yeah.
Okay. So regardless, there's going to be some infrastructure within the GPU that is having trouble communicating or having it's being caught by its slowest component at this point in time, and there's nothing it can do. So it's
you
actually
see a similar thing in Horizon Zero Dawn.
Where's that one?
Shadow, like you can just kind of see this emerging where when you push the cards super hard and then go to a lower resolution, 6400 always wins, and you're getting way lower frame times and horrible variance. And it seems like there's just almost like an 80 hertz cap. In fact, if I remember correctly, there is a slide Intel recently showed in a presentation where they're like 90 hertz gaming. What a weird number to choose. Why wouldn't they say 120? I think there's a hardware flaw in Alchemist that is already noticeable on a low-end card that is capping out at 90, and there's no point in launching an A780. I really think, and this is why I get annoyed when I see people like, oh, well, this. It's like, I can't promise you it's going to get better. For all I know, there's a fundamental flaw here that Igor thinks he's already found.
Yeah, well, he's definitely found situations where it exists. What the flaw is would need hardware diagnostics. When you and I were chatting prior to this, just in Skype, one of the things came up. You were talking to me about price and what price would validate this. And you messaged me about that. And I said, if the frame time variance is this bad, I don't know if I could recommend it at any price point unless I had specific specific caveats. I would say, for instance, I would probably in this, because humans are way more vulnerable to fluctuations in frame time than they are. And it's odd example. I know when Half-Life Alyx came out, I had a Rift S, and I was in forums of people actually complaining about having the index because for that game specifically, it was an amazing experience. But the people that were more sensitive to frame time, because the frame rate of the set was so high and the fluctuations were so massive, it was a harder experience to summarize to deal with than dealing on a lower end headset that had a capped frame rate, just because there was way less variance, and people are very sensitive to variance. So for me, when I see like really wide frame time variance in this, I would be like, I would basically be telling anyone that was in the situation who got the card, cap your maximum frame rate, which is a weird thing for me to recommend, but that's the only way I would probably be able to stomach having someone have this card and have a good experience. So it's like, and that makes it hard for me to give I remember the Crossfire experience and the SLI experience, and frame time variance is really important. And I wouldn't wish anyone go through that experience unless they know how to mitigate it by capping your maximum frame rate, trying to reduce the amount of fluctuation between them. And the thing is that much variance it would hurt even variable refresh displays. Like that much, that's yo-yoing a bit too much. You need that window as narrow as humanly possible. And there's lots of times where people will tell you, oh, well, this game maybe runs at a lower overall frame rate on this card, but the experience felt better for some reason. And almost always it's frame persistence and variance between frames. So it's so strange, because it does make it a hard sell. And finding a bottleneck like this is really interesting. I mean, bottlenecks aren't always a bad thing, because you can engineer around it on the next generation if you can isolate specifically what it is. It's a bad thing for current generation always, but it's not necessarily a bad thing in the long run, because if you have it flatlining in the same place all over the place, that's really easy to QA.
But yeah, and so just to directly address like my concern here is I've seen people in the Moore's Law is Dead Discord, which you guys get access to if you support us on Patreon, say things like, well, I hope it's 130, I hope it's this. And I can find RX 6400s for $135 in MSI one on Newegg right now after rebate. $135. The pricing crashes happen. Intel's missed the boat. I know it has more RAM, but I don't agree with this marketing of like, I wouldn't double down that it's going to pan out the way you think it might when they say we have different tiers of pricing. We're pricing it like the worst case scenario, because everything above the worst case scenario has horrible frame variance. They put Control and Borderlands 3 on their list of optimized titles. I'm showing you benchmarks right now of the A380, where in these optimized titles, it's not always great. At least in Control, it's pretty bad. And so I think when they say tier 1 optimizations, they're just talking average frame rates. For all I know, it's going to feel like the worst case anyways. And I don't know where you price. I think the A380 should be 120. I think because it is worse than a 6400 and it's not reliable. You're basically playing Russian roulette every time you turn on your PC, which I don't know. I think that's worth at least paying $10 less.
Yeah.
And then you have the A580, which they say is a 3050 competitor. I don't know. Maybe should be $200 at most. I can't see any of these cards being close to the price of what they pretend to compete with. And again, I think there's going to be benchmarks that hit the averages I leaked 2 years ago. There will be games where it performs like a 3070 Ti, especially when overclocked. Will be, but that's not the problem.
Have we seen their... we haven't seen any games with XeSS, right, so far? And we haven't seen...
No, it doesn't work yet. I asked.
So we haven't seen any games with XeSS. We haven't seen any... have we seen ray tracing support in the driver yet?
Yes, I mean, you can run some games with ray tracing with the A380, and from what I've seen, it's hard to really say what's what, because I've seen some people argue, well, it doesn't lose as much performance as Radeon, but it's like, I just think it is already capped at a frame rate anyways. So it's running ray tracing. It's not crashing in ray tracing, I guess, but it's too early for me to really have any opinion on if it runs it well or not.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about forward features. Going back to our earlier thing, what are the specific things that could add a fine wine quality to it and potentially improve? And the thing is like, honestly, I've been playing around with AI for fun a little bit recently, and there is going to be in games sometime soon something, whether it's generating textures via AI or something like that, where we're going to start seeing use cases for AI acceleration in video games. It might be 3, it might be 5 years down the road before we get to real time. But I mean, that's kind of hurting in the fine wine window. It's not the best for it. But if we find out that these cards are better for having some of the acceleration in those specific areas, they could age better. And the frame time variance is obviously the biggest problem. And whether or not, like looking at the Wolfenstein one's even worse. But when you scroll down the list, which it's a lot to stomach, and it's very interesting to see whether they can mitigate it in hardware. And if there's a Wolfenstein engineer or someone out there that can run diagnostics on it, please do post those online somewhere. That would be the most interesting tech content I've seen in a really long time. Someone could pass them an A380 and then just let them run it in engine with some diagnostics and see what's taking up all this frame time. That would.
But does it matter, by the way, if fine wine gets better in 5 years? Like, I hate to be this guy, but like, there were so many people that said the 1060 would age worse than like the RX 480, and it's like, Hardware Unboxed just did a 50 game roundup where it's like 10% worse, and okay, so you waited 6 years to have a Polaris card 10% better. I don't care whose fault it is, but I'm just saying, once you're taking over 3 years, I think the fine wine argument can matter if the other card doesn't work. But if it's like you gain 10%, so what, I'm telling someone to buy this card now that will get a 10%. It's, there's got to be some kind of a, just buy something, just buy a 3070 now, then, and buy Battlemage in the future instead of wasting your time on this.
I think that the only area where fine wine matters is from a getting a market share on fine wine isn't you having a card that ages better. It's on a larger group of people having cards that have features that are making them age better and developers targeting those features. So if you're looking at it just on the consumer, the individual consumer perspective, then you're right. They should have just bought whatever. It wouldn't have been a big deal. It's not worth waiting 6 years. But if the reason that the fine wine exists is because of asynchronous compute or half floats or whatever, some type of acceleration in ray tracing, some type of acceleration in AI upsampling, and that's what's going to create the fine wine down then having a larger group of the audience on that will push that sooner in time, and it will allow for engineers to feel confident to build new features going forward. So from the other end of the industry, not the consumer end of the industry, but to some extent, convincing more people to get cards that age better, if it's specifically a feature-based thing that's making them age better, does mean that more features will come to life faster and that they'll get embraced more. So, and if it's embraced more, then engineers can move on to the new feature that they want to implement. If we're still trying to implement something that was in PS4 but didn't come into desktop graphics cards to 2 years ago because everyone told everyone to buy 1060s, then instead of, if that had shifted, like if I had just imagined the scenario where 80% of the market share was RX 580s instead of 1060s, the gaming landscape would look differently. Just in terms of every game developer would have embraced the hardware features, especially if it was Vega, just because Vega had a few more features. And now modern cards have even more features, but those features could have come earlier. We would have seen the engineering push earlier, and then new engineering would come into play. But the slower gamers ramp up on the features, the slower new features get implemented. And I think that's the one caveat. I agree with you entirely on the consumer side, it doesn't matter. On the engineering and hardware side, the larger adaption that happens quickly, the more standardized it gets, the more the tools get upgraded in engines, the more diagnostics get better for it in engines, the more that we move on to the next thing to implement the same way.
Greasy, what's wrong? Heat getting you down? No? You're paying too much for Windows keys? Well, come on, you know you don't have to do that by now. After all, it's certainly been no secret that CDKeyOffer.com has been a reliable sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead for years. They're the go-to place that I recommend my fans use for getting PlayStation, Microsoft Office, and Windows operating system keys for reasonable prices. You don't want to spend a ridiculous amount of the percentage of your build's price on a Windows operating system. Go to cdkeyoffer.com to get a legitimate, reliable key to build your new system without wasting too much money. I use them to make the Alder Lake system next to me for benchmarking graphics cards, and if I build a Zen 4 or Raptor Lake system this fall, you can bet I will be going to cdkeyoffer.com right away to get a reasonably priced Windows 11 key. If you do go to cdkeyoffer.com, make sure you use the offer code BrokenSilicon to get 25% off Windows software and DieShrink to get 3% off everything else on the website. They even sell gaming chairs, mice, and keyboards right now. It's a good place to go to get reasonably priced products and to also show your support for Moore's Law is Dead. Go to cdkeyoffer.com today. All right, now I want to roll into like a kind of a couple final things about Alchemist here. So number one, just based on what you've seen, do you think it's mostly a software problem? Do you think it's all a software problem? Or do you think there really could be some scheduling things there? Because it is worth pointing out, yes, they've had 10 years to optimize, and I think it's entirely unforgivable that they don't have more stable drivers now. But I would understand why maybe their scheduler is garbage, because they haven't had to schedule a card stronger than a 1050 Ti ever. So what do you think is likely the culprit here?
Yeah, it could be. Like, it's a good thing you bring up the scheduler, because the scheduler is what queues things to all of the different arrays of shaders and TMUs and ROPs and whatever they've built to handle those specific tasks. And some of those things work really well at small scales. And we've seen GPUs that scale better, and we've seen GPUs that scale worse. And it's cool seeing, I think RDNA 2 is a really interesting because it scales really well. And Ampere scales better. It scales, I'm not sure whether it scales a little bit better or worse than the 20 series, but it looked like the 10 series didn't scale quite as well. Mm-hmm. They've made changes to that since then that improve the scaling of hardware over time. And
Ampere, they seem to be fixing it somewhat in drivers, but at least a year ago or so, there is a scheduler. The scheduler in Ampere doesn't seem to be as capable as what's in RDNA 2, but it doesn't seem to be a huge handicap for the level of performance they're hitting.
Well, schedulers are designed to take advantage of idle time on. They're designed to queue things up efficiently and also look for opportunities. And that's where a lot of performance can be gained. And if that specific aspect of the hardware isn't scaling to more shaders or whatnot, then we could be seeing a hard limit. And they could be using a lot of electricity for diminishing returns on gains. So they could have found that they went to whatever, 2 tiles, 4 tiles and whatnot. And the percentage was going
higher teraflops. It's 1 tile, but they're just not going to clock it very fast, it seems.
Yeah. Well, you're losing clocks too. And as soon as you start losing clocks, then you're not pushing other things that are a little bit more stable in the GPU. So there's always a trade-off between clocks and specifically the layout of the hardware, because you're kind of slowing down the other aspects of it. But I think that there is a hardware bottleneck here that we're seeing. It could be that you could isolate around it in drivers and make individual optimizations to games that mitigate it, but you're never going to see that across every game. The flatlining is what bothers me the most. When you start seeing those things get closer together, that kind of is showing that it doesn't matter if you try to mitigate it by either feeding more voltage or more clocks, like giving them more clocks to the card. If it's stuck at that point, that's saying that there's something fundamental there that's a little bit more worrying, which I'm curious about. It could be that it could be, and it still could technically be in the driver layer, where it's just maybe there's a lot of driver overhead and we're actually seeing a CPU bottleneck across that. It could be in an internal hardware bottleneck. There's kind of several ways you could look at that, but it's very interesting to me. And that does make me worry that there's a fundamental hardware. It could be one that they've already solved in the next generation of hardware. And we're speculating on something now that they're even ashamed to release, which is and we're trying to use that to project their future roadmap. But
I'm not, but that's the thing. I'm not using it to project their future roadmap. I'm just, Amiable Chief writes in, he says, Tom, I know this is a bit of an early question, but at the rate at which Intel are not rolling out Alchemist, what do you feel this portends for Battlemage? You've said that the whole Alchemist launch seems like a glorified beta test without any real world data rolling in from live systems for them to analyze and apply lessons learned to Battlemage. I'd really classify this as an alpha test at best. No, DG1 was alpha. We got to stop making excuses for the biggest silicon company on earth. Why do they get it to make excuses and we just spank AMD and Nvidia anytime they mess up? But because I really don't think we can expect much until at least Celestial. Also, third time's the charm. Well, that would be like fifth time or something. But like, so no, I want to say I leaked Battlemage information in December. I haven't changed anything I've said about Battlemage, and it's just so funny how many people are going, well, Intel's doomed with graphics, and I'm like, I don't know if they are or aren't. But
They
what I
need a
do
win.
know is that this is not what they wanted it to be, and they don't have enough excuses. Or they're not eating enough humble pie for me to give them a break, because they're not. It doesn't work. I think there's going to be a lot they can do with software, but I think it's at least partially hardware limited that they will fix in Battlemage. But my problem is, again, and we keep coming back to this, they've had a decade of actually having the most market share in graphics. They have all of these employees, they have all of these people working. If they can't execute on this, and I also know Raptor Lake's getting delayed, and Meteor Lake's being delayed, and Sapphire Rapids isn't out, and Ponte Vecchio's not out. My issue with Battlemage isn't Alchemist performance. My issue with Battlemage is the main problem Alchemist has is that they can't fucking launch something on time like they say they will. And so if they can't do that with Alchemist, why would I believe they can do it with anything? Until they launch Meteor Lake before 2024, I don't believe anything they say about anything anymore. And it's not because Alchemist has hardware problems. It's because they can't seem to do what they say they will. And that is a management problem, in my opinion.
No, that is. I'm picturing even following AMD, Nvidia, all of these companies for like, I don't know, 15, 20 years. I remember when AMD was missing all of their releases, especially, they were Vega was almost a year behind.
The PS4 Pro had FP16 a year before Vega came out.
Well, I might have been, it could have been a lot of things. There could have been a lot of things. I mean, when Lisa Su took over, the big thing that changed with AMD is cadence. To some extent, it was just cadence, improving and iterating and hitting deadlines and just doing that over and over again. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying just a few seconds ago, but Battlemage faces the problem if Intel doesn't get widespread, doesn't get adoption, doesn't get that loop, doesn't get their features optimized for, then they miss the opportunity to even add new features. They miss opportunities to even make hardware better in the future. And to some extent, they have to get something out. But what they needed was probably a closed ecosystem to do it. Windows is going to introduce way too many things for them to compete against. It's kind of a shame.
Yeah, if only they had something called DG1 that was in a closed ecosystem for 2 years.
What was the closed ecosystem for DJ1? What was it? There's no game console. It's not like a Surface, or it's not like
they gave it to all developers, though.
That's the difference. That's still in the Windows ecosystem. Like, I think that they need the people making software for this and games for it to understand it fundamentally. If you talk to devs on Nvidia and AMD GPUs, they can go on for hours about documentation or specific things or optimizations that they've had to do, or weird, especially because like game devs world is kind of like battle stories. They have a battle chest of stories, and then they can explain. They'll be like, oh, we had this crazy performance bottleneck, and we kept playtesting and we give it out to specific people, and then the frame rate would crash like crazy, or alphas would come on screen. But then we found this one thing. I talked to this one engineer, and they said, if you did this, there's all of that, and Intel's missing out on all of it right now.
Now, I have to be very careful how I say this, but what if I told you there have been devs who have had DG2 cards for 8 months?
Did they put it in, and did they test it? Did they actually run diagnostics on it continuously? Is it?
I won't elaborate because I'm worried any word I say, they'll be able to say, oh, that's how that guy talks. But yes, and then the Intel people get back to them, and it's a nightmare of trying to diagnose anything.
Well, okay.
I'm saying there's been people helping Intel test this outside of their company for a while, longer than people realize. Like, guys, I had pictures of Alchemist early last year, so that's how long people have had them.
The type of focus is critical. And I'll use the Steam Deck as an example. We've probably seen more iteration and more features, more like drivers adjustments going on through the Steam Deck development than we've seen in like 20 years of Linux. And you can't say Linux hasn't been dominant in so many spaces with the most technically advanced people on earth for forever. Like, Linux has existed in that space. The people that know the most about tech were in love with Linux, and they still weren't pulling things on they were pulling crazy things. I don't want to disrespect them. They did amazing work, but they weren't doing the work necessary to make it a mainstream gaming platform until the Steam Deck opened the gates to that. And now the progress on Wine, the progress on Proton, all of that has been amazing. Seeing that, I've never had a device that needed so many updates at launch, but actually got them relatively quickly, and being pleasantly surprised when I turn it on a month later in a game that couldn't run can run now. And Intel doesn't have any of that, and it's possible to be a giant monolith or a giant company or be something like Linux and literally have how many servers, how many everything, how many technical minds on this, and not having the same level of progress as when they get a little tiny handheld to millions of users' hands, and then having the game developers seeing people playing on it, and then having the people that are playing on it tell them information that's useful, repeating bugs, explaining these things, seeing the commonalities, and then making and closing that loop. And it takes you can throw resources at something, but type of focus is important. There is a critical distinction in how you can focus on some things. And there are some precursors, some catalysts before you can have that focus happen. And it's something really beautiful that we're seeing with the Steam Deck right now in the Linux community that we hadn't seen prior, despite the fact that it was so widespread. And Intel needs a product win like that. It needs a reason, because it doesn't have consoles as a backbone. Because PC versus console devs were kind of strange for a long time, because the devs were aware of everything that existed in the console space, and they were aware of what they had to turn off when they brought it to the PC space, and vice versa. And they would have, but there was tons of documentation, there was tons of bug testing, there's tons of communication between everyone on all of those fronts. And Intel needs to open up all of those channels of communication, but it needs a reason for people to care. Because if Intel had shipped me an Alchemist GPU while I'm in developing my game, yeah, I might have put it in a couple of days and played with it, or passed it to a dev to look at it. But I wouldn't have done the same scrutiny that we do with other levels of hardware when we find common issues and people complain bugs, and we ask them what their hardware is, because we know it's not going to be a large portion of the market share. And there's also the minimal returns. If you put it in and it runs and your game doesn't crash, you know how many devs that makes happy? They might not even there's so many devs that just okay, well, whatever, it works, right? That's a big deal for devs. And sometimes that's enough on specific game hardware, especially smaller devs. If it's crashing all the time, crashing and black screens and weird things like that are a much bigger deal than frame time variance for most devs, unless it's widespread enough. And even still, let's say that these devs that you were talking to that had one in hand, and they could have noticed that, but they don't know. They're not talking to a million other devs that have the exact same thing to know whether it's common across all of their game engines, their specific software infrastructure. They might be it's a one-off case, but it's running. It didn't black screen on us, right? And that's good enough for me. So that all of that stuff exists. In order for Intel to make this a product, they need to have released it, which they have done. But they need to have some kind of design win where they're getting people, and people need to start learning and documenting the very interesting features of the hardware, because that's what's going to win in the dev land. And when it wins in the dev land, that falls back to gamers. Gamers enjoy the benefits of widespread documentation and communication on various hardware features. And that's what we're missing with Battlemage. I know lots of features that exist in Nvidia and AMD GPUs and how they're utilized. I talk to devs, and as soon as there's a problem, ideas come to the forefront right away about how to optimize around them. Whether if we're shipping for console and that scenario comes up, we can maybe try this or this, or they'll contact one of their devs that they know that works exclusively on consoles, and they'll be like, what do you think about this? And they'll be like, oh, here's this documentation I made on this. Try this out. And there's all of this shared information on this. And currently, I can't imagine Intel has anywhere near the same level of that. And it needs a scenario to create it.
Yeah, so I guess actually what I would say is, again, I don't think Alchemist's performance really tells us almost anything about Battlemage. I think too many people are going to read into that and write off Battlemage. Again, guys, I'm the one who leaked the codename Elasti first. I know what Battlemage is, and I'm not saying it's not going to succeed. But the funny thing is Alchemist's launch, what I'm going to be looking for is how stable the drivers get over time, one, and actually not the overall performance, not fine wine in the traditional sense. What I'm going to be looking for is, does Sapphire Rapids launch this year? Because for me, Battlemage is moving to tiles. And I don't care about how Alchemist performs. I know that they're going to learn from it and make Battlemage better from a hardware level. What I want to see is Raptor Lake not slip to November. What
Yeah.
I want to see is Meteor Lake launch by the middle of next year. Although, frankly, it sounds like it's basically confirmed not to, just so everyone knows. Like, so I want to see everything else. I don't care what division it's from, come out when Intel says it will. But if I keep seeing things slip into mid next year, I'm going to go, I don't see evidence this company's fixed its problem, which is management and execution. I'm sure Battlemage can be good, and I'm sure they'll learn a lot from Alchemist. I just want to see them actually do what they say they will.
Well, I think it's actually showing a more of a fundamental problem with Intel's communication, their marketing, and it doesn't, to some extent, what they're showing is it doesn't even matter if they have a good product.
Yeah.
Because they need to have the right people communicating this in a way that's straightforward, that users understand. They need to be admitting their caveats and explaining their roadmaps around that. And they need to be, like, honestly, oddly enough, I don't know Raja or anything, but I saw that shift with AMD's marketing. AMD's marketing went from being overconfident and then rubbing a lot of people the wrong way, especially when they flopped on their face, to when they shifted to partially reserved. And when they were partially reserved, then people were are feeling just better about it in general. And Intel's marketing, like watching their events and stuff, is a nightmare a lot of the time. The way that they communicate these products, and Jensen can just walk on the screen with a black vest and pull something out of an oven, and it comes off better than their entire presentation. And that says a lot. It says a lot about the general understanding of the user base. It says a lot, and the fact that to some extent Intel kind of comes off as, when they're doing a GPU launch, they kind of come off as the rich son of a rich whatever, just saying, here, you get to go on the stage of all these places and talk about it without having earned it, in the sense that, I mean, AMD and Nvidia have been making GPUs since whatever, like the original Fury and the TNT2 and the TNT1, like these are ancient GPUs. Almost all of the patents and stuff go back to them. Like they have so much history, and they all, both of them, whether you like ATI/AMD or whether you don't, or whether Nvidia, they both earned the right to stand on the GPU stage and hold something up and put it in front of people. And Intel is using something they've won somewhere else to show that. And this is why what's hurting Battlemage, they could have an amazing Battlemage, but they have to get their marketing in order. They have to be able to communicate what's interesting about it. They need to be able to use the tech resources, the YouTube tech resources, without seeming skeezy about it, without seeming like they're using their CPU weight to stand there. Like they should just be there because this is cool. If they had done the event and they just completely opened it up to Gamers Nexus, and they said, hey, and if they started with like a crazy liquid nitrogen overclocking, and they're like, you know what, we don't know what this is going to look like, have fun with it, it would have been way better. It would have been in the hands of somebody. If they had given one to Hardware Unboxed, given one to Gamers Nexus, and said, you know what, there's going to be problems, but have fun with it. What's the coolest scenario you can come up with this? Then people would be talking about the situations where it does incredibly well. And they'd be like, did you see when he did this? And it was really interesting.
And again, because I think I know it was designed to be they called it a 3070 Ti before the 3070 Ti was even out.
Yeah.
And I'm sure in some games it will perform like one.
Totally.
And then let Gamers Nexus say, hey, if you play this one popular game, it's incredible. Like, just let them do it.
Yeah, or just don't even tell them. If they would have come in without that weight, without being like, here's a very limited thing. Don't show all of it to people, because people's imaginations are the worst aspect of all of this. They're going to be imagining the worst case scenarios. And then we're fighting with invisible giants all over the place. If we had just had them say, hey, we know this isn't going to be perfect across the board, have fun with it, I think it would have mitigated so many problems in that regard. Gamers would have just been like, cool, what do we find out about this? We can find out whatever we want about it. And then it just gets to be a fun project, pulling it into your computer and seeing what the heck goes on. I know tons of people that probably would have bought a 380 if it was handled in the right way, just as a card to see what the heck's going on with it. We haven't had a new architecture playing around in the space for since Diamond, whatever, like some crazy alternative GPU way back in the day. There's so many people that would have just liked to have it on release, even if everything was sketchy, if it was fun. And then gamers would have put it in, you and me might have grabbed one as a second one just to be like, what the heck does this even do? And then we would have forgiven it a lot, but we can't forgive it if Intel's marketing is using these tactics.
Yeah. And I mean, and again, that's my problem is, I think people think this is them eating humble pie and it's about to launch, but I'm telling you guys, I don't think we're going to have widespread reviews for at least a month from now. And there's going to be another month of basically silence, I think, of like people not really knowing what's going on. They're like, okay, well, you just talked to Linus. You just talked to Gamers Nexus. Where are the cards? Guys, AIBs haven't been briefed. I think I said this in the live stream. AIBs haven't been briefed on the bomb yet.
When if they have those voltage issues that you're talking about, AIVs will not only not have been briefed, they're going to be scared.
They are. And I have, well, yeah, I guess I should be careful how many details I give, but like AIBs are just very confused right now. So this idea that there's going to be some launch, I'm skeptical of a launch in a month. And I think what we're going to see is a lot of weird messaging for 2 more months. And then it's going to come out. And then I hate to say it, I think the shit's going to hit the fan. I think if they would have just been modest, they would have said, hey, it does this well. It does this well. Isn't that cool? But what we're going to see instead is, oh my God, it's almost Q4. Where is this card? And then they're going to get it. And it's going to be so all over the place. And they say, well, wait, you said it would beat a 3060 in this. It does. You know, I don't know.
I hate that like Nvidia is laughing every time we use their cards as a standard because it just hurts everyone else. Like that fluctuation, how wide that range is on a GPU. And this is the big problem with Vega prior to to RDNA. So with Vega and the previous architectures, the fluctuation between Radeon GPUs to the comparable NVIDIA GPUs were huge, especially in specific engines. As soon as you went Unreal 4 or whatnot, that the range and the GPU's performance fluctuated between like, oh, it's like a 1080 Ti, like it's like a 1080 Ti to a 970. What the heck's going on here?
Well, right? Yeah, Vega 64, especially Vega Liquid, would perform about like a 1080 Ti, and like I tested one, you know, it would. I mean, the Radeon 7 I got to perform like a 2080 Ti in a couple of games. The 1080, but like Vega 64 would be like a 1080 Ti in Battlefield, and then you pull up another game like I think Assassin's Creed, all of a sudden it barely beats a 1070. Like that is just all over the place.
It's all over the place, and that window, and what I feel like what AMD did with RDNA specifically is they just like, we are engineering around that window so that NVIDIA can't hurt us as bad. And they just narrowed it right down. With RDNA and RDNA 2, they got that window as tight as they possibly could because they knew they weren't going to get the market share for the standard to be shifted to them, where the conversation isn't. Because that's when you get people discrediting a card. You'd be like, have you seen it run on that game? You know, they'll just throw away with that argument. It'd be like, it's not useful all the time.
That used to be a pet peeve of mine before I had a YouTube channel. Like when I would just argue people in the WCCF Tech comments, like they would just be like, look, it can't even beat a 1070. And then I'd post, I'd respond with it beating a 1080 Ti. I'm like, look, the 1080 Ti can't even beat Vega.
Well, that's the weird thing about samples. Yeah, you can use samples and you can discredit things one way or another. And it's very interesting, though. I think that we can. I like AMD. I talked to AMD engineers at GDC 2018, and they basically completely. And this was in the Vega days, and they said exactly that they needed to overcome. They had to engineer around the worst case scenarios, even when the worst case scenarios weren't their fault. They understood, like the individual engineers that I talked to, because I went to the technical conferences for no reason. I'm an artist. I only understood half of what was said, but I thought they were very interesting. And then you had all like AMD engineers and NVIDIA engineers and game devs and engine techs all in that room. You could just chat with them afterwards, which is a really beautiful thing. But I remember seeing, like, I'd look and see what they have in the name tags. If they had NVIDIA or AMD, I'd go up and talk to them. But I talked to the AMD engineers, and they were very humble and very interesting. They're like, I'm like, must suck that it looks this way when your cards are actually better. They're like, we know, but they're like, you know what? At the same time, we need to make sure that it's not possible for us to be pushed out of the ecosystem in this way because of that. We have to engineer around those faults. And it was a very kind of humble, interesting conversation. And I really respected that approach because at least they're saying, yeah, it sucks. And it'd be great if we could just convince all gamers this, but it's not a realistic thing. And we could say, hey, you look at console space, you see that when you engineer or when you build games around what the hardware strengths are, instead of having half of your games literally targeting the weaknesses for some reasons, like when you had whatever the Witcher 3 and Crysis 2 just throwing insane amounts of tessellation on things that are below the floor of the game, like weird things like that can happen in games where all of a sudden you're tanking performance for no reason. And they had to be like, well, you know what? Yeah, it sucks that stuff like that can happen in games. Then our cards can look bad, but we also need to make sure that we're we're competitive on all fronts so that we're not even able to be pushed like that. And that's very respectful. And Intel needs a bit of that. They need a bit more of that in that communication. Yeah, we have weaknesses in hardware. We can be pushed around in this or that way, but we got to engineer around that. So look out for Battlemage, right? Or look out for whatever the C letter one is.
Celestial.
Celestial,
Well, I think that's a good point to end on when it comes to the Intel discussion. Okay, so Clean Sweep writes in and he says, "Hey, Bryan, with RDNA 3 and Lovelace around the corner, what's the nightmare scenario that only a game developer, art designer would think of when it comes to supporting new hardware and or software features? A lot of people think of the obvious, like having to do last-minute ad of sponsored features or needing to do extra Q&A on testing new hardware. But what's the sort of thing only real hands-on developers would make you think or worry about?" Because I do think there's an interesting question. We're about to have, I guess Raptor Lake is just kind of beefed up Alder Lake, so it's probably not that much harder to program for. And Zen 4 is, again, probably not that much worse than Zen 3 if you already do that well.
Mm-hmm.
But RDNA 3 is going to be different, like really different than RDNA 2. And Lovelace isn't as much of a departure, but I think it's actually going to be a little more different than some people expect in terms of the architecture. Like, and they're both coming out at the same time next to Alchemist.
Yeah.
Can you give any insight into like what developers are thinking right now with 3 new graphics hardware architectures coming out at the same time and on new motherboard platforms? Like what are people what are people worrying about, or is it really not that much of a worry because how much of it is handled in the drivers they give you?
Game devs are excited for new features, wary of implementing them. They're wary of big shifts that they can't, and they want to make sure that their tools keep up. And there's some things that I kind of wanted to talk to you about, but maybe I'd have to save it for another conversation, just between like engines and like way we set up rendering between like forward and deferred rendering. Sometimes the other thing too is, so game devs sometimes deviate from the update path. So if you have like a hyper realistic game and you have people dedicated to keeping Unreal, let's say, up to date, then you can always be pulling in new features. But if you go with a more stylized approach on your visuals in any way, if you're not just trying to create hyper reality, sometimes there are reasons that you might want to prefer a forward render over a deferred render. And also sometimes you have to separate your engine and you have to do custom builds of your engine, which makes it harder to integrate new features from it. So to some extent, game devs that have made those decisions can be a little bit worried about being left behind when new hardware comes out. Let's say it has a really cool new feature, but you, for a stylized look or for a really interesting approach visually to a game, you went and started customizing Unreal. And then when you do that, it costs you a lot of dev time too, because you could be spending like 4 or 5 hours making special builds of the engine just to have specific render sets. Because as soon as you go away from the Unreal's typical PBR pipeline, these are certain things that you might end up having to do. And those are the big fears. If there's new features, and then some devs will have advantages over other devs. And in some ways, we're in a kind of weird space that we haven't been in forever, where realistic games are almost getting a little bit easier to make than unrealistic games on a tech level, but they're getting harder to make on an animation level. So we get like hyper realistic characters, but if you're not up to snuff, you'll have weird looking character movements and stuff like that. Anyways, when game developers make these decisions on games around hardware, first of all, usually they're targeting some level of console hardware, unless you're like Star Citizen or something like that, that's intentionally trying to target PC first. Second of all, some of the decisions that we make might hurt the ability to implement things that people might be asking for. Like right now, I mean, I've been playing around with the ability to implement things like TSR, FSR 2.0, or DLSS in our own project. But if that, or like talking, at least being able to communicate the framework that would be possible to integrate those things. But if there was a new feature, if NVIDIA just suddenly came up with something that, let's say it's an AI upscaling, right? That took your low texture and made a 8K version of it, and that required a new version, then we need to wait for Unreal to implement it. But gamers don't kind of understand the delays in the pipeline like that. They're like, why don't you have this feature here? Oh, and then the worst thing is that they have references.
Why are devs so lazy? Why didn't you just add this thing NVIDIA said? Why don't you have RTX IO?
Well, I could even imagine in a game like, let's say, I don't I just use Borderlands as an example, but let's say, I don't know whether they do this, but they could have done a custom version of their engine to be able to do some of the visual tricks the way that they were doing. They could have maybe changed their style of rendering to maybe like a mixed forward renderer to be able to do certain things. These are decisions they might have made. They probably didn't. I'm just speculating. When you get to more visually stylized games, sometimes you make decisions like this. But
I don't know how much I can add to it, but what I can say is I've messed around with the INI files, and I know Borderlands renders it like a traditional looking game, but with like a pastel color palette or something. And then they just add the outlines, almost like with anti-aliasing. They trace the outlines. There was actually a way in the INI files to remove some of the artsy effect, and you get better performance because they were spending rendering to render the black outlines over the models.
Well, a lot of black outlines too it's called with an inverse hull or something like that, and they actually make a duplicate of the geometry and scale it out to go around it. So that's one method. And other things that they do, sometimes they're doing, oddly enough, like in Wind Waker's day, when you did cell shading, it was a massive performance gain because you had ways to actually take advantage of that. But in modern game development, it's not really much of a performance gain to do a stylized look. The only thing it really gives you is forgiveness if you end up doing like lower res textures, or forgiveness if you do
because they're all using the same tools, right? And then they're adding the old school look on top.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a bit different in the way that the render pipelines have changed. There's certain things like that. But when it comes to new hardware, so if we have RDNA 3, you're saying RDNA 3 is very different, and that is...
Yeah, it's pretty... I mean, my understanding is that it actually does double FP32 per compute unit, kind of like how Ampere did, but also not like how Ampere did, because it's more of a true beefing up of double of most of the resources. It's not just one thing.
Instead of like a 1.5 increase like Ampere was.
Actually, that's something, of course, I've been heavily analyzing as I compare these, preparing a couple of videos about it. But Ampere's was actually like a 1.3, despite doubling CUDA cores. Well, it depends how you do the math, right? If you divide backwards, it sounds bigger. But in terms of like actual boost per compute unit, if you don't account for, clock speeds, like RDNA 3 isn't going to double performance per compute unit at same clock speeds. It's going to be higher than what Ampere brought, though.
Interesting. It's interesting that you say that. But the thing is with the modern hardware is it would be interesting if they were more like just around neutral with the consoles. But they're not. Like if we're talking about RDNA 3 and Ampere, then what's going to be equivalent to a PS5 and a Series X by that point? It's probably going to be like the 60 series on both of them.
I think the 60 series is going to crush the PS5, actually.
Exactly. So if we have that level, then we're not that worried about that. I think we're more like, we just suffered in a good and bad way the 1060 generation, and we would have been so happy if the 1070 was the 1060. Because we had hardware that was faster in some ways than what like a PS4 Pro or a Series X was. That was the standard in PC, but it was worse in other ways. And it was hard to optimize around all of that when the vast majority of PC gamers were playing with kind of a strange hardware. It wasn't all wins for a 1060 to be the standard. If we're talking about, and some games really take advantage of it, and other games are struggling because of specific optimizations they relied on. And when we're talking about new architectures, if these GPUs are going to be so powerful, like the doubling we're seeing, but the difference between the high end and the low end seems to be growing in this space. I think that's kind of what's interesting, but the low end's come up a lot, but the high end just getting so crazy. We're talking 40, 50, 60 teraflops. Now we're talking 90, 80, 90 in some cases.
Yeah, they're going to be 70 to 100 teraflops from both companies.
I guarantee the shader workloads will be much, much better on PC. I'm curious how much of a win it is on the other aspects of the pipeline, because it could have some things where the workload's just almost instant on PC on the high-end cards, and the other cards are nowhere near that much.
I could add on to that, but I think you might need to go, man. It seems like...
My wife wants to say something.
All right. I was just trying to wait for a good time to do it. So look, hey, I want to thank you for coming on.
Nice.
Plug what you need, plug your the studio you work at. Tell people, or anything else. I mean, if you wanted to plug, a fast food restaurant you like, I don't care.
I just want to I'll plug you. Everyone watch Moore's Law is Dead. This is a great thing to watch. No, you can always check me out. I do lots of different types of art. I mean, I'm most live with my pixel art. I think in a year or so, when we show our new game, then I'll be able to show a lot of new art that I've been doing. That is going to be really cool. So I'd say watch to the future, but expect that it's not going to be, it's going to be a bit off. But once we show it, I think that I would be excited to come on and talk about the tech and the stuff we're doing with that game then. So,
oh, of course, you're absolutely invited on, especially if you have something specific to promote. And I mean, people will be able to see it on your Twitter. I'll put your Twitter, of course, in the description so people can find all of that stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I do a lot of pixel art, but I do lots of other stuff. I haven't been showing as much of my personal art lately and other stuff because I seem to have the biggest following around my pixel art. But I've been doing a lot of non-pixel art lately, and I can show all of that once this game starts, where at least gets trailers released and stuff. So I'd be excited to show that more in the future. So, anyways, that's me.
All right. Well, again, thanks for coming on. Thanks for giving me what I'm suspecting is too much time. No, I was trying to look for a good time to cut this off earlier, and I feel like in the future I'll know to do it sooner. We were in the pocket. We probably should have just ended right at the Alchemist thing, but I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about the upcoming art.
Yeah, there's some other stuff that I wanted to pick your brain about too, but it's fine.
Again, thanks for coming on.
No worries.
Thanks everybody for listening. Subscribe to Broken Silicon, your podcast app of choice. Give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps us find people outside of YouTube. Subscribe to Moore's Law is Dead and ring the bell button on YouTube as well, and consider supporting us on Patreon to submit questions. But I don't want to plug any more. Don't want to waste any more of your time. All right. Thanks for coming on, Bryan, and thanks everybody for listening. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, I don't do this alone. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and special assistance by Carbon Cry. Find all of our information, including the information of sponsors you can support, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. If you would like to send fan mail or hardware to us, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead at P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. And speaking of fans, patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content possible. The aging business model of spamming ads all over the content is dying. The future of media will be built on fans paying for the content they actually want to exist. And so if you have the extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who would love to meet you and talk to you about computer hardware. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the entire back catalog of Flyover States podcasts and other projects Moore's Law is Dead has done, and thanks in the credits of videos and other perks as well. And hey, if you can't afford to support us, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media, Reddit, and forums. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast app. All of this really does help so much. And if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, hire Tom for consulting, or are a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its patrons supporting it, and so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Full, AV, Anthony Greffa, Greg Patecki, Muhammad Al-Kawari, Brett Jones, Aaron Close, Little Germany, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, Ivan Gay, Brian Riggleman, Dr. Forbin, Sam Miller, Deke, Thomas Rupp, The Mechanical Philosopher, Terrence Herod, SNES Calmers, Tom Bailey, Greg T. Wanchuk, Andrew S., Frank Zielinski, Daniel D., MJB1, Eric Jackson, Justice Brennan, Sammy Good, Valco Malev, The Boss Haas, Nicholas Buckner, Spamtum G. Spamtum, Jonathan, Lord Starscream, General Drips, Blake, Franco Frederic, Matthew Lazier, Jensen Wang, Nathan Mose, Azuris, Gregory S. Hacker, Dominique Koch, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, My Name is Nobody, Caillou Markelli, HeartForRoom.com, Original Ross, Licky, Stefan, David Cowan, Ricky Tan, Christopher A. Butler, GZ Ziggy, Sarcastro, Stefan Hart, Jason B., Meat and Pork Stew, Tim Robb, Luis Correa, Ian Clifford, Jesse Jaskowiak, Travis Gooding, The Holden Mobley, Nanya, Chris Rich, Deepest Learners, Mad, Zutsu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Michael McGee, Chuck Glidden, Sammy Malas, Greg, Odd Trini, Patrick Groh, Amy Will Chief, Brett Summers, Annie Nguyen, Stephen Dick, Tommy, Kunden, Brucha, Mark Mitchell, Mac Daffy, Dalmain Peterson, James Anderson, Dwight Truey, Mac Raidmaker, Seth Thomas, 3DS Boy 08, Hal Booma, Norithio, Matthew Landavazo, Stefan, Cole Attic, Henry Zhang, Jetson N, Brendan O'Connell, The Grid, Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Jason Bowen, Noah Nicoella, Hexapuma, Chrysantine, Jerome Ferriera, Zabeat03, DSys, Thomas A. Teef, Klein Britannian, DNA Tech, 50C Desert, Axel Cisneros, Royce Mayer, Charles Russell, Reginald R.E., Morpheus, Teak Autumn, Jake Miller, Jackson Miller, Jess MMH, Sandy Garrido Saunderson, David Eastland, Cameron, Andre Jacques, Gaiman Since Reagan, Jeff Sadler, Eric Osborne, Loophole 35, Windstar, Joker, James I. Radner, Corey Leonard, Sammy Molas, John Shin, Justin Buttle, Kelvin, Austin Haggerty, Roger Davies, Nal Lima, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.